Hello beautiful people. Welcome to Arcane Paradox. In today's episode, we explore, what if Harry collapsed during Quidditch Tryouts and Madame Pomfrey's scan revealed 42 Obliviation charms since birth. Hit like, subscribe, and join our community of story lovers. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Fall. The tryouts were supposed to be straightforward. Oliver would have been planning them since the last week of summer, bowling the team twice before September with hand-drawn diagrams of formations and a 3-page manifesto about the importance of arriving early. Harry had read exactly one page before using it as a bookmark and forgetting about it, which was probably not the level of dedication Oliver was hoping for, but Harry had other things on his mind. Like the fact that he was 12, had survived a possessed professor the previous year, and still hadn't finished his transfiguration essay that was due Thursday. Still, when Saturday morning arrived grey and breezy and smelling like wet grass and autumn, Harry felt something loosen in his chest. The pitch was that effect on him, it always had been. The moment he stepped through the changing room doors and heard the familiar creak of the wooden benches, the smell of leather polish and old wool, something that had been wound tight since the train ride simply let go. "You look like you've been released from prison," Ron observed, watching Harry pull on his Quidditch robes with something approaching reverence. "Feels a bit like that, yeah." "Mental," Ron said, but not unkindly. He was sitting on the bench eating an apple he'd nicked from breakfast, legs swinging. Ron wasn't trying out, he'd been characteristically blunt about his own flying abilities, but he'd come along anyway, which was the kind of thing Ron did without making a production of it. "Hermione says you should have finished the transfiguration essay last night." "Hermione says a lot of things. She also says Wood's new training schedule is structurally unsound and prioritizes individual performance metrics over cohesive team strategy." Harry paused, one arm halfway into his sleeve. "She's been reading it." "She read it twice and annotated it." Ron took a bite of his apple. "I don't think she actually wants to come to tryouts. I think she just wanted to mark something up with a red quill." Harry laughed, a real one, the kind that came from somewhere genuine, and finished pulling on his robes. Through the small rectangular window near the ceiling, he could see the sky doing something complicated with clouds, shifting between pale silver and a bruised sort of gray. "Good flying weather, actually. Cool enough that you stayed sharp, warm enough that your fingers didn't go numb in the first 10 minutes. He grabbed his Nimbus 2000 from the rack and felt the familiar tingle of well-maintained wood beneath his palm. "Right," he said. "How bad do you think it'll be?" "The tryouts?" "Wood." Ron considered this with the gravity the question deserved. "He had a clipboard when I saw him at breakfast. And he was using a ruler on something." "Merlin. Good luck, mate." Harry headed out into the morning. The pitch was already populated when Harry walked out onto the grass. 7 second years he didn't know well were clustered near the goalposts, holding broomsticks of varying quality and wearing the particular expression of people who had convinced themselves they were brilliant right up until the moment they had to prove it. Fred and George Weasley were sitting on their brooms 3 feet off the ground, chatting to each other with the comfortable ease of people who had no anxiety whatsoever about their continued place on the team. Angelina Johnson was stretching her arms over her head and ignoring everyone. Katie Bell was checking her broomstick's tail twigs with the focused attention of someone who'd done this particular pre-flight ritual since she was 8. Oliver Wood was standing at the center of it all with a clipboard and an expression of almost painful intensity. "Harry." He said it the way other people said finally, even though Harry was 4 minutes early. "Right. We're starting in 5. I want to talk you through the new Seeker protocols before we begin." "There are Seeker protocols now?" "There have always been Seeker protocols. I've just formalized them." Oliver flipped to a page on his clipboard that was dense with handwriting and small diagrams. "Basically, I need you flying wider search patterns this year. Last season you tended to hover in the center of the pitch and wait for the snitch to make its move, which is reactive rather than proactive, and it worked," Harry pointed out. "It worked last time. I want something more systematic." Oliver looked up from his clipboard with an expression that was somewhere between passionate and mildly unhinged. This is the year, Harry. I can feel it. I've been captain 3 years and I've never felt it like this. This is our year. Harry had heard some version of this speech before every single Quidditch-related event since he'd joined the team. He nodded with what he hoped was the appropriate level of solemn agreement and escaped before Oliver could show him page 2 of the Seeker Protocol document. Fred appeared at his elbow almost immediately. He showed you the document, Fred said. Just page 1. There are 11 pages, George said, materializing on his other side. We've counted. Page 7 is entirely about wind direction. He's drawn little arrows, Fred confirmed. Tiny ones. In different colors. He color codes by wind speed. Harry shook his head. He really loves this, doesn't he? More than he loves anything else in his life, Fred said, with what sounded almost like affection. It's genuinely touching. Also deeply concerning. The tryouts began at 8:30. Wood ran the chaser candidates through passing drills and then a modified game scenario against Fred and George, who were instructed to aim bludgers near the candidates rather than at them, a distinction Fred and George appeared to interpret with considerable latitude. The candidates were, as a group, about what Harry had expected, 2 who were clearly very good, 1 who was astonishing and would almost certainly make the team, and the rest who were fine, but fine wasn't quite enough for Gryffindor, not with Angelina and Alicia and Katie already on the squad. Harry, meanwhile, was given his own assignment. Wood wanted him flying seeker patterns while the chaser trials were happening, as a sort of parallel evaluation. Get used to the new patterns, Wood had said. Feel them out. Let them become instinct. So Harry flew. And for a while, for a good, solid, uncomplicated while, it was just that. Just flying. The pitch fell away beneath him, the voices of the candidates and Oliver's shouted instructions becoming something small and distant, and Harry was nothing but a body on a broomstick cutting through cool October air. He banked left and felt the wind push against his cheek. He climbed and felt the familiar slight pressure in his chest that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite exhilaration but was something sharply itself. He leveled out at about 60 feet and just breathed. The snitch wasn't out, so he was flying the search patterns Oliver had drawn on page 1 of the document, which involved a sweeping figure-8 movement across the breadth of the pitch. It was actually pleasant, as exercises went. Meditative, almost. The methodical sweep of it, back and forth, eyes moving, watching the light for any gold glint, it suited something in him that he couldn't quite name. He was on his 3rd pass when the headache started. It wasn't alarming at first. He'd had headaches before. The scar on his forehead had given him headaches at various unpleasant intervals since he'd discovered it could do that, so a headache during Quidditch practice was not, on its face, any cause for particular concern. He blinked, adjusted his grip on the broom handle, and continued the sweep. But this wasn't the scar. He knew the scar's particular burn, it was sharp and directional, like something pressing in from outside. This was different. This was interior. This was deep. It started behind his eyes and moved backward through his skull like something spreading in water. Not sharp, spreading. Like a bruise forming from the inside. He slowed the broom and hovered, pressing 2 fingers to his temple. Below him, the tryouts continued. He could hear Oliver shouting something encouraging at the extraordinary chaser candidate. Fred and George were laughing at something. The sky tilted. He didn't register it as tilting, exactly, it was more that the horizon line, which had been reliably horizontal his entire life, seemed to make a quiet unilateral decision to reorient itself by about 40 degrees. Harry grabbed the broom with both hands and something cold moved through him, something that wasn't temperature, that had nothing to do with the October morning. What, and then something in the center of his head, not painful, not exactly, but enormous, like a door opening onto a room that was much larger than the door should have allowed, simply gave way. He had exactly 1 second of the absolute certainty that he was about to fall before he did. The broom stayed in the air. Harry didn't. He heard someone shout his name, it might have been Fred, it might have been Oliver, the sounds were doing something strange and distant, and then the ground came up and the world went very dark and very quiet. He came back to himself in pieces. First there was warmth. Sterile white warmth, which didn't quite make sense until he placed the smell, antiseptic potions and clean linen, and understood he was in the hospital wing. Then there was the specific discomfort of a hospital wing pillow, which were universally terrible, stuffed with something that managed to be both too firm and somehow also insufficient. Then there was the sound of quiet, urgent voices nearby. He opened his eyes. The ceiling of the hospital wing was as familiar as it was unwelcoming. He'd stared at this ceiling before, after the troll incident, after a bludger had nearly rearranged his face during the Slytherin match last year. He'd gotten good at reading the ceiling's particular texture of pale stone and shadow. He's awake. That was Ron. Harry turned his head and found him, and Hermione, sitting in the chairs beside the bed, both of them wearing expressions that were carefully composed into something that was trying to be casual and not quite managing it. Ron's ears were slightly pink. Hermione had a book open in her lap that she clearly hadn't been reading. "Hey," Harry said. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over gravel. "Hey," Ron said. "So. You fell off your broom." "I know I fell off my broom. Just. For the record. 60 feet. Was it 60? I didn't have time to measure." "The grass is still a bit flattened," Hermione said. Her voice was doing something strange, controlled in a way that meant she was working to keep it that way. "There's apparently quite an impressive indentation." "Brilliant," Harry said. He tried to sit up and found that his body had mixed feelings about the project. His head swam, but gently, not the terrible opening door sensation from before, just ordinary lightheadedness. "How long was I out?" "About 2 hours," Ron said. "It's nearly 11. Harry absorbed this. "Did anyone make the team? The Chasers?" Ron stared at him. "You fell 60 feet off a broomstick and you're asking about Quidditch Tryouts." "I was curious." "The girl from second year," Hermione said, because she understood that some questions simply needed answering. "Leanna Marsh, I think." Oliver apparently burst into tears, but I've only heard that secondhand. "Happy tears or?" "Presumably." Hermione set her book down with a soft, decisive sound, and Harry noticed that she'd been gripping it hard enough to leave creases in the cover. "Harry. Madame Pomfrey ran diagnostics while you were unconscious. Standard procedure after a fall from height, checking for spinal damage, head injury, that sort of thing." Something in her tone made him go very still. "Right," he said carefully. "She found things," Hermione said. They aren't injuries from the fall." Ron leaned forward, elbows on knees, and he wasn't pretending to be casual anymore. "She's coming back in a minute. She wanted to wait until you were awake." He paused. "She looked pretty, I mean, she's Madame Pomfrey, she doesn't really, but she looked." "Looked what?" Ron searched for the word. "Angry," he said. "Really, really quietly angry." The door to the ward opened. Madame Pomfrey was a compact woman with iron-gray hair and the particular manner of someone who had spent 30 years being the most competent person in any given room and had grown entirely accustomed to this fact. She was brisk and unsentimental and she ran the hospital wing with the efficiency of a military installation. Harry had seen her face register exactly 3 emotions in the past year: professional concern, exasperation at students who wouldn't stay in bed, and a particular bright-eyed satisfaction when she'd healed something complicated. The expression she was wearing now was none of those. She pulled up a chair and sat, which she almost never did when talking to patients, as though sitting would cost time she didn't have, and placed a sheaf of parchment on the bed beside Harry's hand. She looked at him for a moment before she spoke, and there was something in her look that was very different from the brisk clinical gaze he'd grown used to. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Head hurts a bit," Harry said. "Better than before the fall though. Before I fell, there was this," he gestured vaguely at his skull. This spreading feeling. Yes, she said. I know what caused that. She didn't explain further immediately. She straightened the parchment on the bed, a small precise movement that he thought might be her version of gathering herself. Mr. Potter, when I ran the standard diagnostic sequence after your fall, the spell returned some results that required me to run secondary diagnostics. And then tertiary. She paused. I've been doing this for 31 years. I've run diagnostic scans on perhaps 4,000 patients. What your results showed me this morning, I have never seen before. Harry felt the stillness from before come back, sharper now. Tell me, he said. Pomfrey picked up the top sheet of parchment. It was dense with fine spidery diagnostic script. Harry couldn't read most of it, the notation was specialized, but at the bottom, circled twice in red ink, was a number that he could read perfectly well. That number, she said, represents the count of Obliviation charms that my diagnostic detected in the magical architecture of your memory. 42 memory charms, cast at various points since shortly after your birth. She said it clearly, without hedging, and Harry noticed that she was watching his face very carefully as she said it. These are not charms cast on adults in your vicinity whose residual magic you might have absorbed. The targeting signatures are specific and precise. They were cast directly on you. The ward was very quiet. Outside the tall windows, the October morning continued its unconcerned business, clouds moving, leaves turning, the distant sound of students crossing the ground somewhere. Harry was aware of Ron going very still in his peripheral vision. Hermione made a sound that was too small to be a word. 42, Harry said. Yes. Since I was born. The oldest traces are consistent with a cast date within the first year of your life, Pomfrey said. The most recent, this is important, Mr. Potter, and I need you to hear it carefully, the most recent was cast approximately 14 months ago. Before your 11th birthday. Before you came to Hogwarts. Harry picked up the parchment and looked at the circled number for a long moment. He felt like he should be feeling something enormous, like the ground should be shaking, like the walls should be doing something dramatic. But what he actually felt was very quiet and very precise, like the moment before you solve a puzzle when all the pieces suddenly arrange themselves and you can see exactly where they go, but haven't moved them yet. Someone kept erasing my memories, he said. Since I was a baby. It appears so. There are parts of my life I can't remember. I just thought that was normal. I thought everyone's childhood was patchy. He set the parchment down. I thought the Dursleys were that I just didn't have good memories worth keeping. Pomfrey's jaw tightened. It was brief, but Harry caught it. The gaps in your recollection of childhood are almost certainly directly attributable to these charms, she said. 42 targeted obliviations over 11 years would create very significant lacunae in long-term memory formation. Not just specific memories, the charm architecture I'm seeing suggests that at least some of these were cast on the formative memory clusters, which affects, she stopped. It would affect more than just what you remember. It would affect how you process experience. How you integrate what you learn. The quiet stretched. Pomfrey, Harry said. He was surprised by how level his own voice came out. You said some of them were cast by Death Eaters. She hadn't said that, he realized the moment the words were out. He hadn't been told that. He'd just known it. Something in him had arranged itself around that fact with a certainty he couldn't account for. Madame Pomfrey went very, very still. I haven't yet analyzed the casting signatures with sufficient precision to, but you think so? She looked at him for a long moment. Then, yes. Some of the signature patterns are consistent with dark magic casting. Others are not. She paused, and he understood from the pause itself that there was something she was deciding whether to say. She decided against it, for now. I need to call in specialist colleagues before I make any formal determinations about signature attribution. This is beyond a school medical case, Mr. Potter. What was done to you is a serious crime under wizarding law. deliberate obliviation of a minor is, she stopped, looked down at the parchment, looked back up. It carries a significant custodial sentence. You're going to report it, Harry said. I've already drafted the formal notification, she said, and there was something in her voice that made him certain she'd done it while he was still unconscious, the moment she'd understood what she was looking at. Professor Dumbledore has been informed that I need to see him this afternoon. I've also sent a message to St. Mungo's for the specialist consultation. She folded her hands in her lap. I want to be very clear with you about something, Mr. Potter. This is not your fault. Nothing that was done to you reflects anything about you. You are a 12-year-old boy who has been the victim of a sustained, systematic assault on your mind and your memory, and the fact that you've managed to be who you are. She stopped again, and it was the most human he'd ever seen her, the crack in the clinical composure. She recovered it quickly. You should rest this afternoon. I'd like to keep you in the ward overnight for observation. Okay, Harry said. The memory fragments may begin returning on their own as the diagnostic disturbed the charm structures slightly. If that happens, if you experience anything, any flashes of memory, any disorientation, you come and find me immediately. Day or night. You understand? Yes. She stood, smoothed her robes, and was almost herself again, brisk and certain and in motion. Your friends can stay, she said, which he understood was the most generous thing she could offer him right now. She walked away down the ward without looking back, and Harry watched her go, and then looked at Ron and Hermione. Ron looked like he wanted to hit something but wasn't sure what. Hermione looked like she'd been doing very rapid calculations and had arrived at a conclusion that frightened her. 42, Ron said, the word coming out with a kind of careful restraint that was unusual for him. Someone did that 42 times. 42 times that Pomfrey could detect, Hermione said quietly. She said the diagnostic returned those results. If any were cast with sufficient skill, there may be. She stopped herself. Sorry. That's not helpful right now. No, keep going, Harry said. I want to know. Hermione looked at him carefully, the look she got when she was deciding whether the truth was kind or just honest and had decided on honest anyway. The most sophisticated memory charms leave traces in layers. Some layers are visible to diagnostic scans. Some, if they're cast by a very powerful or very careful witch or wizard, can be buried beneath the visible trace. So 42 is a minimum number. She picked up the annotated parchment from the bed and turned it over. The other thing is, obliviation of that frequency and that duration, especially when it starts in infancy, doesn't just erase memories. The mind builds itself partly on memory. If you're building your internal world and someone keeps coming along and pulling bricks out of the structure, Hermione, Ron said. What? He's just woken up. He said to keep going. He also just fell 60 feet off a broomstick. I'm fine, Harry said, because he was, in the way that mattered, he was clear and awake and he wanted to understand the full shape of the thing that had been done to him. There was something almost steadying about wanting to understand it. It gave him something to do with the feeling that had been building in his chest since he'd looked at that circled number. Hermione. What does it do? The long-term kind. She set the parchment back down and looked at him with a kind of helpless honesty. It can suppress magical development. Not completely, you're clearly powerful, you wouldn't have been a natural flyer or responded to your wand the way Professor McGonagall described if you weren't, but it can create a kind of ceiling. A dampening effect. And emotionally it can, she chose the next word carefully. It can make a person feel like they don't know who they are. Like there are parts of themselves they can't quite reach. The ward was very quiet again. Harry thought about 11 years in a cupboard. About feeling like he occupied the wrong amount of space wherever he went. About the first time he'd touched his wand in Ollivander's and understood, in some bone-deep way, that something was finally where it was supposed to be. He thought about all the memories he didn't have that he'd simply assumed other people didn't have either. It turned out that was just what childhood was, gaps and sketches and half-formed impressions. Hadn't it? Right, he said. Harry, Hermione started. I want to find out who did it, he said. He said it the same way he'd said everything else, quietly, flatly, without theater. He looked at Ron and then at Hermione. I'm going to find out who did it, and I'm going to find out why, and I'm going to know every single thing that was taken from me. He paused. But first, I'm apparently staying overnight in the hospital wing, so. Ron exhaled through his nose, something that was almost, very nearly, a laugh. Right. Priorities. I'm serious about the other thing, though. I know, Ron said. I know you are. Hermione reached across and put her hand over his, brief and warm and then gone. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Outside the windows, the clouds had shifted and a bar of October sunlight fell through the glass and across the hospital wing floor, pale gold and temporary, moving on. Harry looked at the circled number on the parchment. He picked it up and held it and didn't put it down for a very long time. The afternoon came in quiet. Hermione brought her Transfiguration textbook. She brought it for herself, obviously, but she also read a passage aloud to Harry about the theory of magical impression and memory, which was relevant in ways that were interesting rather than upsetting, which was very much a Hermione way of providing comfort. Ron fell asleep in the chair for an hour and woke up claiming he'd been thinking with his eyes closed, which no one believed. Around 3 o'clock, McGonagall came. She walked into the ward with her usual precise gait and Harry noticed immediately that she was holding herself differently. There was a rigidity to her shoulders that wasn't her normal disciplined posture. Her expression was composed in a specific way that revealed, to anyone paying attention, that something was being contained behind it with considerable effort. She sat in the chair Pomfrey had vacated and looked at him. I've spoken with Madame Pomfrey, she said. I know. How are you feeling? Everyone keeps asking me that. Humor me. Physically fine. Bit of a headache. He met her eyes. I know what she found. Yes. McGonagall's jaw worked briefly. I want you to know that this institution takes what was done to you with the utmost. She stopped. Started again. This is a crime, Mr. Potter. A serious and sustained criminal act, perpetrated on a child, and I want you to know that whatever resources Hogwarts can provide toward understanding and remedying it will be provided without reservation. It was a very McGonagall speech, Harry thought, formal and precise and professional and underneath all of it, absolutely furious. Thank you, he said. Dumbledore will speak with you tomorrow. Something crossed her face, brief and complicated. He's been informed. What did he say? Hermione asked from the corner. McGonagall glanced at her. She'd briefly forgotten Hermione was there, which meant she was more rattled than she was showing. When Madame Pomfrey told him. What did he say? That's between. McGonagall stopped. She looked at Hermione for a moment with an expression that was hard to read. He said very little, she said finally. Which is sometimes more informative than a great deal. Nobody said anything to that for a moment. McGonagall stood. Mr. Potter. I'll have your dinner sent up. Try to sleep. She paused at the foot of the bed. I'm glad Poppy ran those diagnostics. She ran them because I fell off a broomstick, Harry said. Yes, McGonagall said. She did. She left. Harry listened to her footsteps fade down the corridor. She knows something, Hermione said, the moment the door had closed. She thinks she might know something, Ron corrected. There's a difference. That look on her face when she said Dumbledore was informed, Hermione. Harry kept his voice easy. Tomorrow. She subsided, but he could see the thoughts still moving behind her eyes, quick and restless, building frameworks. He wasn't going to stop her, he wanted her building frameworks. He just didn't have the energy for them tonight. The dinner came on a tray. It was better than hospital wing dinners usually were, and Harry wondered if that was Pomfrey or McGonagall or just coincidence. He ate most of it and lay back and listened to Ron explain, with surprising passion, why the Chudley Cannon's defensive line was architecturally superior to their offensive capacity, a topic which Hermione engaged with by asking clarifying questions that were just penetrating enough to suggest she was taking notes somewhere. Harry let the sound of their voices carry him. He looked at the ceiling and thought about 42 holes in his memory and what might be living in each one of them, waiting in the dark. When the first fragment came, it came quietly. He wasn't asleep. He was staring at the ceiling and not quite thinking about anything in particular when it surfaced, not a picture, exactly, more a sensation. The warmth of a lap. The smell of something floral, a perfume he didn't know but recognized somewhere under the knowing. A voice saying his name in a way that made his name sound like it meant something. Harry. Not his Aunt Petunia's voice. Not any voice he could consciously place. He blinked and it was gone. But the warmth of it stayed, brief and phantom and real enough to ache, for the rest of the evening. Ron fell asleep again around 9, properly this time, his chin dipping toward his chest. Hermione had abandoned the Transfiguration textbook in favor of a small book on memory charm theory that she'd apparently had with her the whole time and produced with the air of someone who had been planning this, which she definitely had. She read without talking, which was the best kind of company when you needed company but didn't need noise. Harry watched the last of the sunlight leave the tall windows and the sky turn from gray to dark, and he thought, someone took something from me. 42 somethings. And I am going to find out what every single one of them was. Outside, Hogwarts Castle went about its enormous, ancient business, staircases moving, portraits murmuring, torches guttering in drafts from places that had no reasonable source of wind. Somewhere out there, in the headmaster's circular tower office, Albus Dumbledore was presumably awake and presumably thinking. Harry wondered what, exactly, he was thinking about. He wondered if Dumbledore was afraid. He closed his eyes and the phantom warmth came back, briefly, faint as the memory of a smell. He didn't reach for it. He let it settle. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow we start. He fell asleep before Hermione put her book down, and when he dreamed of a woman with green eyes and a laugh like bells, and when he woke at 2 in the morning with tears drying on his face, he couldn't remember what she'd said, but he knew she'd been saying it to him, and he knew it had mattered. He lay in the dark for a long time before he went back to sleep. In the morning, the investigation would begin. For now, the ward. The dark. The knowledge of 42. Harry Potter pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and breathed. Chapter 2, The Unraveling. Dumbledore came at 9. Harry had been awake since 6, which was earlier than he'd have liked and later than his brain had apparently decided. He'd lain in the grey pre-dawn quiet listening to the castle wake up around him, the distant percussion of the great hall being set for breakfast, a ghost drifting through the far wall of the ward singing something mournful and off-key, the particular creak of the hospital wing's oldest floorboard that Pomfrey's morning rounds always announced. He'd eaten breakfast mechanically, staring at the parchment with the circled 42 that he'd kept on the bedside table. He'd read it 6 times. The number hadn't changed. Ron had gone back to the dormitory around 8 to get Harry clean clothes and his school bag, at Harry's insistence that he was going to be in lessons today regardless of what Pomfrey said, which turned out to be prescient because Pomfrey said exactly the opposite. She'd done it nicely, with the particular brand of immovable gentleness that she deployed when she wanted you to understand that the conversation was technically polite but also definitively over. 2 more days, she'd said, checking his eyes with a small lit wand. The diagnostic disturbed the uppermost charm layers and I need to monitor for cascade fragmentation. What does that mean? It means that when you push on one part of a complex enchantment architecture, other parts sometimes respond unpredictably. She'd lowered the wand and looked at him levelly. You may experience more memory fragments. Some may be disorienting. I'd rather that happened here. Harry hadn't argued. Partly because she was right and partly because there was something almost useful about being in the hospital wing, it was removed, quiet, separate from the ordinary machinery of Hogwarts life. He needed somewhere to think. Somewhere the day's normal noise wouldn't demand things from him. Hermione had arrived at 8:30 with his transfiguration essay, which she'd finished for him, presented it without apology, and taken the chair by the window with a second book on memory charm theory that she'd apparently found in the restricted section by reasoning that it was relevant to medical matters and therefore she was technically authorized to access it, a piece of logic that would have impressed a lawyer. "Pomfrey won't like you being here during classes," Harry said. "I've already spoken to her," Hermione said, not looking up from the book. "I told her I was doing research relevant to your case. She said I could stay until 11. You told her you were doing research relevant to my case. You need someone researching, Harry. This isn't." She turned a page with perhaps slightly more force than necessary. 42 Obliviation charms don't just happen. Someone planned this. Someone sustained it across 11 years. That requires resources, access, and knowledge, and I intend to understand the full parameters before Dumbledore gets here and frames the conversation in whatever way suits him. Harry looked at her. "You think he's going to try to control the conversation?" "I think he's Dumbledore," she said, simply. "He always frames conversations. He's very good at it. He makes you feel heard and gently guided and entirely comfortable, and then afterward you realize he told you exactly what he wanted you to know and nothing more." She finally looked up. "I like Professor Dumbledore. I respect him enormously. That's exactly why I think we need to be careful." From the doorway, Ron said, "She's been preparing since 6:30, set Harry's bag on the floor, and sat down with the expression of someone who had fully made peace with his companions being extraordinary and occasionally exhausting. He produced a second apple from his pocket. "There's toast if you want it. I put it in a napkin." "You're a hero," Harry said. "I know." Ron tossed him the napkin. "Also, the whole school knows about the fall. Everyone's talking about it. Seamus thinks you were dive-bombing and misjudged the pull-up. Dean thinks you were hit by a bludger. Lavender Brown thinks you," he paused, visibly editing himself. "Lavender has a theory involving the stars." "Lovely." Neville asked if you were okay. "I think he meant it more than most people mean it. Tell Neville I'm fine." Harry ate the toast and looked at the door. "How long do you think before the door opened?" Dumbledore was wearing robes the deep green of a forest at night and carrying nothing, no wand visible, no notes, no parchments. He entered the ward the way he entered most spaces, which was to say without apparent effort, as though the space simply rearranged itself slightly to accommodate him. His half-moon spectacles caught the morning light and his expression was, and here was the thing Harry was watching for, as Hermione had quietly suggested, carefully warm. Warm in a way that was real, he thought. The warmth wasn't fake. But it was also managed. He looked at Harry first. Then at Ron and Hermione. "Good morning," he said. "I wonder if I might have a few minutes with Harry alone." "No," Hermione said pleasantly. Dumbledore's eyebrows rose by a quarter inch. "He doesn't have to be alone for this conversation," she continued, in the tone of someone stating a verifiable fact rather than making a demand. "Ron and I were there when Madame Pomfrey gave him the results. We're part of whatever happens next. If there's something you need to say to Harry that you can't say in front of us, then I think that itself is worth noting." A silence. Ron was eating his apple with extreme neutrality. Dumbledore looked at Harry. Harry said, "She's right." Something moved across Dumbledore's expression. It wasn't quite surprise and it wasn't quite amusement, and it was gone before Harry could fully catalogue it. He pulled a chair to the bedside with the unhurried ease of a man who had decided something and drawn it closed inside himself, and sat. "Very well," he said. He looked at Harry with an attention that was total and serious and kind in a way that made the kindness harder to be suspicious of. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Everyone asks me that," Harry said. "I imagine they do." Dumbledore folded his hands in his lap. "I want to begin by telling you that I know Madame Pomfrey's findings will have been deeply distressing, and that whatever questions you have, I intend to answer as fully and as honestly as I am able." "As I am able." Harry noted the qualifier. Did you know? Harry asked. He kept his voice even. He'd decided this morning, lying in the early dark, that he was going to ask the questions directly rather than arriving at them by degrees. He wasn't going to be managed, even gently. Did you know the obliviations had been done? Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Not evading the question, considering it, which was a different thing. I knew, he said slowly, that certain protective enchantments had been placed on you in your early years. I was told, by parties I believe trustworthy, that these enchantments were necessary for your safety. He paused. I was not told the full nature of those enchantments. I was not told their number. And I want to be honest with you, Harry, I should have examined what was done more closely. I did not, and that failure is mine. It was a careful answer. It was also, Harry thought, probably mostly true, and that was somehow worse than a clean lie would have been. 42, Harry said. That's how many times someone modified my memory. Since I was born. Yes. Some of them have dark magic signatures. Something sharpened in Dumbledore's expression. Madame Pomfrey informed me of her preliminary analysis, yes. I want to be clear that the presence of dark casting signatures does not mean, it means Death Eaters, Harry said. It means people who served Voldemort decided, on multiple occasions, to reach into my mind and take things out of it. He watched Dumbledore. Did they do it with your knowledge? No. The word was immediate and absolute and Harry believed it. No. The Death Eater attributed castings, if that is what the analysis confirms, would not have been sanctioned or permitted. They represent an assault on you, Harry. A criminal one. So do the other ones, Hermione said quietly from her chair. Dumbledore turned to look at her. The ones that aren't dark magic signatures, she said. She had the book closed on her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and she met his gaze with the steady directness of someone who had decided not to be intimidated even by someone they deeply respected. Obliviation of a minor without parental or guardian authorization is a criminal offense regardless of the caster's affiliation or intentions. If any of the 42 were cast by people who believed they were acting in Harry's best interest, that doesn't change what it is. She paused. I've been reading. I can see that, Dumbledore said, and there was genuine regard in his voice. You're quite right, Miss Granger. The ward was quiet for a moment. I want the full investigation, Harry said. Every signature analyzed. Every casting dated and attributed. I want to know who did this, all of them, and I want to know what they took. He picked up the parchment from the bedside table and set it on his knee, the circled 42 facing up. And I want to be part of that investigation. Not told the results when someone decides I can handle them. Part of it. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. You're 12 years old, he said. I know how old I am. What was done to you is extraordinarily complex. The unraveling of it will require, I know it's complex, Harry said. I'm not asking you to hand me a file and leave the room. I'm asking not to be kept in the dark about my own mind. My own memories. He held Dumbledore's gaze. With respect, Professor, keeping me in the dark is what got us here. Something happened in Dumbledore's eyes. It wasn't anger, it was subtler than that, and more significant. It was the look of a man who had been handed a truth that fit uncomfortably and was finding, despite the discomfort, that he couldn't refute it. I will keep you informed, Dumbledore said. Of what I learn, and when I learn it. You have my word on that. And the Ministry? Hermione pressed. Madame Pomfrey said she was filing a formal notification. She has. It will be investigated through appropriate channels. A pause. Though I would urge some caution about the Ministry's involvement in matters pertaining to Harry's, why? Ron said. Everyone looked at him. He was looking at Dumbledore with an expression that was deceptively simple, Ron Weasley doing a very convincing impression of someone who just asked an innocent question. Why caution about the ministry? Ron continued. If someone's committed a crime against Harry, shouldn't the ministry investigate it? Isn't that what the ministry's for? Or is there a reason you'd rather it stayed internal? Another silence, a different quality this time. There are reasons, Dumbledore said carefully, why some investigative processes benefit from discretion. Right. Ron nodded with the air of someone filing that away. Dumbledore stayed 20 minutes more, spoke carefully and not unkindly about what the investigation would involve, mentioned St. Mungo's specialist consultants coming to examine the charm architecture, said that memory restoration was possible in some cases and should not be the primary goal in others, and throughout all of it Harry watched his eyes and listened not just to what was said but to the shape of what was avoided. Dumbledore was not lying, he was fairly certain. But Dumbledore was curating. Selecting. And there was something behind his eyes when he spoke about the protective enchantments, about the parties he believed trustworthy, that was closer to grief than Harry had expected. When he left, the three of them were quiet for a moment. Then Ron said, "He knows more than he said." "Obviously," Hermione said. "He's not going to tell us." "Not yet." Hermione opened her book again. "But we're going to find out anyway." By afternoon the word had spread through the castle in the specific, mutating way that Hogwarts rumors always did, one true fact buried under 8 speculative ones. Harry could hear versions of the story through the open hospital wing window as students crossed the grounds. By lunchtime, he had apparently fainted due to a cursed bludger, discovered a Voldemort-related plot in the Quidditch pitch groundwork, and, his personal favorite, was being secretly treated for a rare condition that manifested only in extremely powerful wizards. That last one, at least, had a certain irony to it. Pomfrey shooed Ron and Hermione out at noon for lunch, instructing Harry to rest, which he did for approximately 10 minutes before sitting up and going through his school bag looking for parchment. He found a blank sheet behind his charms textbook and a decent quill in the front pocket, and he wrote down, in a list that he organized without quite deciding to organize it, everything he currently knew. 42 Obliviation since birth. Oldest, Year 1. Most recent, 14 months ago, before Hogwarts. Some dark magic signatures. Some not. Dumbledore knew about protective enchantments, didn't know the number or full nature. Says he was misled. Memory gaps in childhood, normal assumption of patchy memories, but not normal. Something suppressed, not just erased. Pomfrey, affects memory formation and magical development. Ceiling on power. First fragment last night, warmth, perfume, voice saying my name. Mom. He looked at that last word for a moment. He wrote, what did someone not want me to remember? And under it, who had enough access to do this 42 times over 11 years? The Dursleys were the obvious answer to the second question, except the Dursleys didn't have magic. Couldn't cast a memory charm if their lives depended on it. So whoever was doing this had access to him at Privet Drive. Access to him as a child. Access across more than a decade without interruption. He wrote, Dumbledore placed me with the Dursleys. He knew where I was the whole time. He stared at that line for a while. He didn't write the next thought, but he thought it clearly. At least one of the 42 wasn't Death Eater work. At least one was cast by someone who thought they were helping. Who, with access to Harry Potter over 11 years, would have thought that kind of help was appropriate? He folded the parchment and put it in his robe pocket. The St. Mungo's specialist arrived at 2 o'clock. A tall witch-named healer Voss who had the focused economy of movement of someone who worked in high-stakes medicine and had stopped wasting motion somewhere around her 3rd decade of practice. She came with 2 colleagues, spoke briefly and quietly with Pomfrey at the ward door, and then came to sit with Harry. She ran her diagnostics herself. 3 separate sequences, each lasting about 5 minutes, each producing a scroll of parchment in the spidery notation Harry couldn't read. She didn't speak while she worked. Pomfrey stood nearby watching with professional attention. When the 3rd scroll finished unrolling, Voss set them side by side and looked at them in silence for a moment. Well, she said, and the word was flat and professional and contained within it, Harry thought, a substantial quantity of suppressed feeling. Madame Pomfrey's initial analysis was accurate, as I expected. 42 confirmed discrete castings. She rolled the scrolls precisely. The oldest dates I can confirm to within the first 18 months of your life. The casting pattern, the frequency and targeting, is consistent with deliberate long-term suppression rather than reactive obliviation. This was planned. You mean someone decided to do this before they did it, Harry said. Not just, reacting to something. They had a program. Voss looked at him with a slight recalibration of her expression. Essentially, yes. Reactive obliviation, when it occurs, is typically a one-time or occasional event. What I'm reading here is an architecture, a design structure with specific targets and intentional gaps left between castings for the previous charm to integrate before the next was applied. She paused. Someone was careful. Someone did not want the cumulative effect to be detectable through standard monitoring, so they spaced the castings and layered them in a way that would look, to a cursory examination, like normal magical development. Her voice was neutral. Her hands on the parchment were not. Madame Pomfrey only found it because the fall triggered a level of diagnostic thoroughness that goes beyond standard screening. If I hadn't fallen, Harry said. If you hadn't fallen, it might have remained undetected indefinitely. Voss met his eyes. I want to discuss treatment options, Mr. Potter. With your knowledge and consent. Madame Pomfrey mentioned you want to understand what's been done before we discuss reversal. Yes. That's wise. She settled back slightly. A full reversal is not advisable at this stage. 42 layered charms, some over a decade old, have integrated into the existing structures of your memory in ways that make simple removal dangerous. It would be like, imagine pulling stitches from a healed wound. The wound is closed, but it's closed around the stitches. Remove them carelessly and you reopen more than you intended. She gave him a moment with the metaphor. What I can do is begin a gentle, monitored dissolution process, working through the layers chronologically from most recent to oldest. This would allow memories to surface gradually, in a controlled manner, without the disorientation of a sudden flood. How long would that take? Done properly? 6 months to a year. She watched his face. I understand that's frustrating. Can we start now? Voss looked at Pomfrey briefly. We can begin the assessment phase. I can mark the most recent layers for preliminary dissolution, which is non-invasive, it simply makes those layers more permeable. Your own mind will do most of the actual work. You may begin recovering fragments of those memories naturally, which is gentler than any active removal would be. She picked up her wand. With your permission. Harry nodded. The spell she cast was nothing like he expected. He'd braced for something clinical and probably uncomfortable, but what he felt instead was, a loosening. Like a knot untied behind his left ear. Something that had been set to a specific tension simply released it, and Harry had a moment of almost dizzying relief, so physical and so unaccountable that it was all he could do not to make a sound. All right? Voss asked. Yeah, Harry said. Yeah, what was that? The feeling? That's 42 Obliviation charms meeting significantly reduced resistance from the newest layer, Voss said matter-of-factly. Your mind, Mr. Potter, has been under sustained structural pressure since before you could walk. What you felt was part of that pressure releasing. She capped her wand. It will get more pronounced as we proceed through the layers. After she left, Pomfrey brought Harry a strengthening potion and stood by the window for a moment with her hands clasped and her gaze on the grounds below. Healer Voss confirmed the signature analysis, she said, without turning. Of the 42, she was able to attribute 14 to dark casting signatures consistent with known Death Eater practices from before 1981. Harry went very still. Before 1981. Before Voldemort's defeat. She turned now, and her expression was what he'd come to understand was her version of grave. Which means some of those castings predate your parents' deaths. Someone was casting Obliviation charms on you while you were still an infant and your parents were still alive, Harry. Without, one must assume, their knowledge or consent. The ward felt suddenly very cold. Before Halloween night, Harry said. Yes. While I was at home. With my mum and dad. The earliest signatures date to when you were approximately 8 months old. Pomfrey's voice stayed level by what Harry now recognized was considerable effort. There was access to you, regular, repeated access, that your parents were apparently not aware of. Harry sat with this. 8 months old. He'd been 8 months old, and someone had walked into whatever room he was sleeping in and cast a memory charm on an infant and walked back out again, and his parents had been somewhere in the same house not knowing. My dad, he said, slowly. I don't have almost any memories of my dad. I always thought, I was only a year old when he died. I thought it was just, that I was too young. Pomfrey said nothing for a moment. Some of those early castings may well have targeted specifically what you could retain. They took my parents, Harry said. He didn't say it loudly. He said it like something being measured. Not the night they died. Before that. Someone went in and took them from me before I was old enough to keep them. Yes, Pomfrey said. That is what the evidence suggests. Outside, the October afternoon was getting old, the light going golden and long. Someone on the grounds below was laughing, a student, carefree, heading back from the greenhouses with a bag of dragon dung fertilizer, probably, not thinking about anything more complicated than whether they'd finished their homework. Harry thought about his 8-month-old self. He thought about a pair of hands he'd never seen, careful, deliberate, belonging to someone who decided that an infant's memories of their own parents were a threat to something, and had taken them with the calm precision of someone pulling weeds from a garden. He was quiet for a long time. I'm not going to fall apart, he said eventually. I didn't think you would, Pomfrey said. I just want you to know I'm not. Because I need everyone to stop treating me like I'm about to. She looked at him with an expression that was different from anything clinical. I know, she said. You've been not falling apart for 12 years. I suspect you're very good at it by now. She picked up her tray and moved toward the door. The difference now is that you don't have to do it alone. She left him with that, and the golden light, and the list in his pocket, and the loosened knot behind his left ear. Ron came back at 4 with Hermione and a level of barely contained agitation that Harry clocked immediately. What? He said. Ron glanced at the door and then pulled his chair close. Hermione did the same. They had the air of people who had been talking rapidly for a period of time and had reached a conclusion they needed to deliver. I asked my dad, Ron said. By owl. I know he got it because Errol came back with a reply inside 2 hours, which means Dad was either at his desk or close to it, and he basically wrote back immediately. He pulled a folded note from his robes. He works in the misuse of Muggle artifacts office, right, but he knows people in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. People who actually deal with illegal enchantment cases. He unfolded the note and turned it toward Harry. Ron, the question you're asking is serious. Deliberate obliviation of a minor is a Category 1 offense under the Improper Use of Magic Act, Section 14b, meaning it carries mandatory investigation regardless of caste or motive. The investigation would be handled by the DMLE's Magical Crimes Against Persons Office. Tell Harry, and yes, I know this is about Harry, that he has the right to request a formal victim advocate if a DMLE investigation is opened. He doesn't have to go through Dumbledore for this. He can go directly. Love, Dad. Harry read it twice. He can go directly, Hermione echoed. Which is significant. Madame Pomfrey's notification creates a record, but it goes through the school. A direct victim's request goes straight to the DMLE and creates a parallel track that the school can't control the flow of information on. You think someone at Hogwarts might try to slow things down, Harry said. I think, Hermione said carefully, that some of the people who will be implicated when the signature analysis is complete may have a lot of influence over how this investigation proceeds. And I think it's worth making sure there are avenues that can't be quietly managed. She opened her second book. Also, I found something. She'd placed a slip of paper between specific pages. She turned to it now and laid the book flat on the bed. The passage she'd marked was dense with technical language, but she'd underlined the relevant portion in her meticulous hand. Memory charm sequences cast on subjects under the age of 3 represent a distinct subspecialty of forensic memory work, as the undeveloped magical architecture of young children means that targeted obliviations in infancy tend to leave not just memory gaps but echo signatures, trace impressions of the removed content stored in the subject's ambient magical field rather than the specific memory centers. These echoes cannot be accessed as explicit memory, but can be stimulated by environmental, olfactory, or emotionally resonant triggers, manifesting as fragments of sensation or emotional impression rather than coherent recollection. In practice, many victims of early childhood obliviation have been experiencing their removed memories for years without recognizing them as such. Harry read it and looked up. "The warmth," he said. "The voice. Last night. You've probably been having echoes of removed memories your whole life," Hermione said. "And because you didn't know, you just felt them and let them go." She paused. "That's not going to happen anymore. From now on, every time you get a fragment, you document it. Time, place, what you were feeling before it happened, what the fragment contained. Everything." She produced a fresh notebook from her bag and placed it on his bedside table. "I bought this from the stationery supply in Hogsmeade over the summer. I hadn't decided what to use it for yet." Harry looked at the notebook. Then at Hermione. "You're extraordinary," he said. "Has anyone told you that recently?" "Not today." She pushed the notebook an inch closer to him. "Start with last night." He wrote for an hour. It was slower going than he expected, because the act of writing it down, the warmth, the smell, the voice, the green eyes and the dream, made it more real, and making it more real meant feeling it more fully than he'd allowed himself to all day. He wrote steadily and didn't stop writing. Ron sat nearby doing his charms homework with the focused lack of pretension of someone who understood that the most useful thing he could do was be normally present. He asked Harry once if he wanted more toast. Harry said no. Ron went back to his homework. It was nearly 6 when the next fragment came. This one wasn't gentle. He'd stopped writing for a moment, flexing his cramped hand, looking at nothing in particular, when it hit, not a sensation this time but a sound, sudden and complete, as if someone had turned up a volume dial from nothing to maximum in the space of a breath. A voice, male, warm, with a specific cadence Harry didn't know, saying something. He couldn't make out the words. But the feeling of the voice, safety, absolute and uncomplicated, the cellular certainty of a very young child that the world was exactly the size of the person holding them and that person was entirely reliable. And then a second voice, the female one from last night, laughing at something the man had said, and the sound of that laugh, Harry's quill snapped. He'd gripped it without noticing and it had snapped clean at the nib, leaving an ink blot on the notebook and a small sharp edge in his palm. He looked at his hand. The fragment was already dissolving, the way dreams did, the feeling remaining even as the details went thin and faded. Ron had looked up. He looked at Harry's hand and the snapped quill and didn't say anything, just reached into his bag and came out with a spare, which he put on the bedside table quietly and went back to his charms essay. Harry picked up the spare quill with his clean hand and wrote, "Dad's voice." Don't know what he said. Feel absolutely safe. He underlined the last 3 words. He looked at the underline for a moment. He thought about how, for as long as he could remember, he had felt the opposite of absolutely safe. Not in an active, catastrophic way, more in the background radiation way, a low-level alertness that he'd assumed was just his personality, just the product of 11 years with the Dursleys and a cupboard under the stairs. He'd thought that was just how he was built. What if it wasn't? What if there was a version of Harry Potter who'd been built differently, who'd had 18 months, however incompletely, in a home where the voice above him meant absolute safety, and someone had reached into that Harry and erased the template. He wrote that down too. Pomfrey came at 7 to check his vitals, temperature, reflexes, magical resonance levels, which she measured with a small tool like a tuning fork that she struck against the bed rail and held near his head. She looked at the reading, wrote something, and said, "Your resonance has increased 7 points since this morning. Is that good?" Given that it increased in direct correlation with Healer Voss's treatment this afternoon, it suggests the uppermost charm layers are already beginning to permeate as intended. She put the tuning fork in her pocket. "Your magical capacity is not what it should be for your age and bloodline, Mr. Potter. It's not poor, you're a capable witch, clearly," she caught herself. "Wizard. You're a capable wizard. But the suppression effect Healer Voss identified has created a lower ceiling than your natural architecture would produce. As the charms dissolve, that ceiling should begin to rise." She paused. "You may find certain magic comes easier. That spells you found difficult become less so." Harry thought about the Quidditch pitch. About the way flying had always felt like the one thing that came without struggle, the one area where whatever ceiling existed didn't seem to apply. "Flying," he said. "Flying was never hard for me." "No." Pomfrey's expression was interesting. Muscle memory and physical kinetic magical responses operate through a different neural pathway than conscious spell work. The Obliviations targeted your memory and your analytical magical processing, your instinctive responses were harder to touch. She considered this. In a sense, the truest version of what you are has always been accessible on a broomstick. Everything else has been operating at reduced capacity. Harry absorbed this in silence. "Reduced capacity," he repeated. "For 12 years. Yes. And when it comes back. When the ceiling rises," Pomfrey said carefully, "you will likely need some time to adjust. Power without practice can be ungainly. We'll work with Healer Voss to ensure the dissolution is gradual enough that you can adapt." She gave him the look that meant she was being professionally delicate. "I mention this not to alarm you, but because the next time you're in defense against the dark arts and you find yourself capable of something considerably beyond second-year level, I'd prefer you weren't caught off guard." Harry blinked at her. "That soon?" "The most recent layers were the thinnest," she said. "Already partially dissolved by this morning's treatment. When I say the ceiling is rising, I mean it's already rising." She stood. "Get some sleep, Mr. Potter. Tomorrow will be more of the same, but different." He wasn't sure what that meant until later, lying in the dark, when he heard a sound from somewhere in the castle, distant, muffled, from the direction of the corridor outside the ward. He lay still and listened. 2 voices. One of them was Dumbledore's. He recognized the register, the careful measured pace of it. The other he had to work at before he placed it. "Snape." He couldn't make out the words. But he could read the shape of the exchange from what reached him, Dumbledore's voice low and measured and very slightly placating, Snape's clipped and controlled in the way that meant he was working to keep it that way. Back and forth. Then Snape's voice again, a phrase Harry couldn't decode, but the final word came through clearly enough. "Signatures." Then silence. Then the sound of footsteps going in opposite directions down the corridor. Harry lay in the dark and added Snape to the list in his pocket. He wasn't sure yet what column to put him in. The next fragment came at midnight, without warning, without preamble, without the gentle approach of the earlier ones. He was asleep and then he was entirely awake and entirely somewhere else for exactly 3 seconds. He was very small. Low to the ground, small child low, viewing the world from a height of perhaps 2 feet. He was in a room he didn't recognize, warm and lit with soft light, and there were shapes around him he couldn't resolve into clear images, but the feeling of the room, something is wrong. He'd been happy a moment ago, he could feel the echo of the happiness, the way you feel the warmth of sunlight that's just gone behind a cloud, and then something had changed. Someone had come into the room, or spoken, or the air had changed in some way his infant self had registered before his adult self could understand, and there was a figure, he couldn't see the face. He came out of it sitting upright in the hospital wing bed with his heart going at a substantial pace, staring at the dark ward with sweat cooling on the back of his neck. He sat still for a moment. Then he reached for the notebook. Figure in the room. Can't see the face. Something wrong. Not afraid of the figure, afraid of what the figure is doing or going to do. Not a Death Eater feeling. Familiar feeling. He looked at that last line for a long time. Familiar. He closed the notebook. He lay back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about the voice in the corridor. Signatures. Snape's voice, sharp and controlled, saying the word signatures to Dumbledore in the dark outside the hospital wing at midnight. Snape knew something about the casting signatures. Of course he did. Snape, who had been a Death Eater. Snape, who had turned spy. Snape, who moved through the dark parts of the wizarding world with the ease of someone who knew where all the furniture was because he'd lived there once. Familiar. The figure in his fragment had felt familiar. Not say familiar. Not worn familiar. Just, known. He put the notebook down and stared at the ceiling for a long time and did not sleep again until almost 4 in the morning, and when he finally did, he did not dream. Outside the castle, the October wind moved through the grounds and shook the last leaves from the trees near the lake, and the giant squid turned in the cold black water, and Hogwarts Castle stood as it had always stood, enormous and ancient and full of secrets, some of which, for the first time in 12 years, were beginning to stir. Chapter 3, What the Blood Remembers. The potion was the color of old copper and smelled like rain on stone. Healer Voss set it on the bedside table with the careful deliberation of someone who wanted to be clear, through action alone, that this was not a casual thing. It sat in a small glass vial, not smoking, not glowing, not doing anything dramatic, it just sat there being copper-colored and smelling of rain, and Harry looked at it and then at Voss. "It's called Memoriae Solventis," she said. "It's not a common treatment because the circumstances that require it are not common. What it does, in simple terms, is accelerate the permeation process we began yesterday. The loosened charm layers will dissolve faster, and the memories beneath them will surface more completely than they would through natural fragmentation." She paused. "I want to be precise about what that means in practice. You won't experience a slow fade-in of gentle impressions. It will be more like, falling into the memory. You'll be inside it. Present tense. Fully sensory. Like a pensieve," Hermione said from her chair. "Similar in quality, different in mechanism. A pensieve extracts and externalizes. This is internal, the memory surfaces within your own consciousness. You remain aware that you're in the present moment, but the experience will feel very real." Voss picked up the vial and held it to the light. "I want to be honest with you about the risk. Some of what you remember may be painful. We cannot predict what the oldest layers contain or what condition they'll be in after 12 years of compression. There's also a small chance of what we call an overflow event, where multiple layers dissolve simultaneously and produce a disorienting confluence of memories. If that happens, you need to tell us immediately." "And if I don't take it?" Harry asked. "The natural process continues. Gradual fragments over weeks and months." She set the vial back down. "That is the safer and more conservative option." Harry looked at the vial. "How much of what was taken from me comes back with this?" "The most recent 6 to 8 castings, with high probability. Fragments of the older ones, with lower probability. The oldest, the infant period castings, are deeply integrated and will require considerably more time regardless." She was watching him carefully. "This isn't a complete solution, Mr. Potter. It's a significant step." "Recent 6 to 8, Harry said. "The most recent was 14 months ago." "Yes. So somewhere in the last 6 to 8 castings is whatever someone didn't want me to know 14 months before I came to Hogwarts." Voss was quiet for a moment. That's a reasonable inference. Harry picked up the vial. Pomfrey, who had been standing at the foot of the bed with her arms folded, said, I want to be present throughout. And your friends, she glanced at Ron and Hermione. If you want them here. Yeah, Harry said immediately. He didn't elaborate. He uncorked the vial and looked at it and thought, briefly and clearly, someone spent 11 years building walls in my head. I'm taking them down. Okay, he said. What do I do? Drink it slowly, Voss said. Lie back. Let it happen. Don't fight the immersion, resistance makes the overflow more likely. Harry drank the potion. It tasted like absolutely nothing, which was stranger than any taste he'd expected. For about 30 seconds nothing happened at all and he wondered if he was one of those people for whom potions didn't work, which was apparently a real thing according to Hermione who had mentioned it once while doing potions reading, and then the ceiling of the hospital wing dissolved. He was outside. He knew, distantly, that he was lying in a hospital bed in Hogwarts, but that knowledge was thin and far away, like a radio signal from another country. What was immediate and thick and present was this, a garden. Summer. The particular heat of an afternoon in July when the air is heavy and bees are working through lavender with professional dedication and the light falls at the angle that makes everything look slightly golden and too good to be entirely real. He was 5 years old and he was crouching in the garden watching an ant carry something 3 times its size across the path, and everything was completely fine. He looked up. The garden was, not Privet Drive. The realization came the way all realizations come when you're 5, which is to say without language, without articulation, just the simple settled fact of it, this was not the Dursleys' garden. This was a garden that was slightly overgrown in a good way, with roses that had gotten ambitious and a stone wall covered in ivy and a gate at the far end that was hanging open onto a lane. And the house behind him, he turned. A cottage. Stone and thatch and crooked chimney. Windows warm with late afternoon light. The door open, and from inside, the smell of something cooking. He'd never seen this place before in his life. And he knew it the way you know the inside of your own chest. The door opened wider and she came out. She was wearing a blue dress and her hair was down, dark red, the exact color of autumn leaves before they go brown, and she was carrying a cup of tea in one hand and squinting at the afternoon sun and then she saw him crouched on the path and she said, Harry James, are you eating dirt again? He looked at his hands. No dirt. No, he said. Good. She came and sat on the garden step, stretching her bare feet onto the warm stone. Come here then. He went. He sat beside her on the step and she put her free arm around him and he leaned into her side and felt absolutely, entirely, cosmically safe in the way that he'd felt the ghost of last night and understood now was the real thing, the original thing that the ghost had been echoing. He looked up at her face. Green eyes. Exactly his. Mum, he said. And she looked down at him and smiled, and the smile was so specifically her, something privately delighted, like she was always slightly amused by how much she loved him, and she said, What? Nothing, he said. Just checking. She laughed and the laugh was the bells from the dream. She pulled him closer and said, Your father is going to be home by 6. He says he has something to show us. Knowing him it's either something genuinely wonderful or something that's going to make a mess of the kitchen. It'll make a mess of the kitchen, Harry said, with complete confidence. Absolutely, his mother agreed, and drank her tea. He went through 4 of them. They didn't feel like individual memories, they felt like falling through rooms. One dissolved into the next without warning, sometimes overlapping, sometimes the edges ragged and uneven in ways that meant something had been cut from the middle. The second one, a sitting room evening, his father on the floor with him surrounded by small objects that were doing things, a cork spinning by itself, a toy broomstick the length of a forearm bobbing gently at waist height, a set of wooden blocks stacking and unstacking in a loop. James Potter had dark hair that didn't sit down properly and glasses very similar to Harry's and an expression of such uncomplicated joy at watching his son reach for the spinning cork that Harry felt the sight of it somewhere in the neighborhood of his sternum like something being put back in its proper place. He reached for the cork and it spun faster. His father laughed. The third one came sharp-edged and cold and already wrong. He was in bed, a real bed, not the cot he'd apparently slept in, a bigger bed, which meant he was older, maybe 3, and it was night and the house was quiet in the way that houses get quiet when everyone in them has been asleep for hours. But Harry was awake, sitting up, because something had changed in the quality of the silence. He couldn't have explained it. He was 3. He just knew, the way animals know, the pre-irrational knowledge that reads the air and the sound and the particular quality of the dark and says wrong, 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 that there was someone in the house who shouldn't be. He watched the door. It opened. Not his parents. He knew it wasn't his parents the way he knew his own hands in the dark, knew by the walk, the shape, the way the person moved through the doorway. He knew this person. He couldn't name them, or the name was in the part that had been removed, but he knew them, and they came to the side of the bed, and Harry, being 3, didn't run or shout but looked up with the direct unblinking attention of small children who haven't learned yet to pretend things aren't happening. The person leaned down. "Go to sleep," they said. "There's a good boy." They lifted their wand. Harry felt it, the particular sensation he'd been feeling in fragments since yesterday, the spreading through water sensation, except now he knew what it was. He knew what that feeling was because it was happening to him and he was watching it happen and he was 3 years old and didn't know how to stop it, and then the memory shattered. He came back hard. The hospital wing ceiling slammed into his vision and he was lying down and there were hands on both his arms and Ron was saying his name loudly and clearly and Pomfrey was at his other side and Voss was standing over him with her wand out in a monitoring position. "He's back," Pomfrey said. "I'm back," Harry confirmed. His voice came out strange. Gravel and strain. He became aware that he was shaking, not dramatically, but consistently, a fine continuous tremor in his hands that he couldn't immediately stop. "Breathe," Voss said. Not unkindly. Matter of fact. He breathed. Ron had both his hands, he realized, had grabbed them when Harry had apparently done something, seized up, reacted, and was holding them the way you'd hold something you were worried might fly away. Harry looked at him. Ron's face was a very particular shade of controlled pale. "What happened?" Ron asked. "I saw," Harry stopped. Breathed again. The tremor was settling. "I need a minute." "Take 12, Ron said. Hermione was very still in her chair, her hands pressed together against her mouth, watching him with an expression that was about 3 careful layers over something much rawer. Harry sat up slowly. Pomfrey helped. He swung his legs off the bed and sat on the edge of it and put his feet flat on the cold stone floor and let the cold be an anchor. "I saw my mum," he said. He said it calmly. He'd decided to say it calmly, distantly aware that if he didn't say it calmly he might not say it at all, and he needed to say it. He needed to say all of it while it was still whole. "And my dad." 2 memories, maybe 3, one was broken in the middle. "We were in a garden. A cottage. Not Godric's Hollow, somewhere else. Somewhere we lived before that, I think." He reached for the notebook. His hands had stopped shaking. "She called me Harry James. She had her hair down." He stopped writing for a moment. Started again. "My dad had a toy broomstick. It was maybe 10 inches long and he was making it fly around the room and I was trying to catch it." He looked up. I'd forgotten completely that I never had a memory of my dad's face. I thought I just didn't have one. I thought I was too young." "Harry," Hermione said, and her voice was very gentle. "I'm all right," he said. "I need to keep going." He wrote. The third memory, I was in bed. Night. Someone came into the room. He paused on this, not for drama but because the words needed to be exactly right. I knew them. I knew who it was. Not a stranger. Not a Death Eater, the feeling was wrong for that. I knew this person, and they came and they stood over me, and I watched them lift their wand, and, he stopped. And the memory fragmented, Voss said quietly. She'd sat down. Her voice was professional and careful. The memory of an Obliviation event is the most consistently damaged of all the removals, because the charm inherently disrupts the recording of the moment it's cast. You will likely never recover that specific moment with full clarity. But the memory around it, I knew who it was, Harry repeated. He looked at Voss. I knew them. Not Death Eater. Known to me. Trusted. I felt, I wasn't scared of the person. I was scared of the wand. He let that sit for a moment. Someone who was trusted in my house, trusted by my parents, trusted by me, was coming into my bedroom in the middle of the night and erasing my memories. Voss said nothing. Pomfrey said nothing. The silence was its own kind of answer. It wasn't a Death Eater doing it that time, Harry said. Was it? The third memory you've described correlates temporally with what we'd estimate as a casting from the pre-defeat period, Voss said carefully. And the signature analysis, the non-dark signatures, Harry said. The ones that weren't Death Eater work. Someone was doing it from inside. From inside my family's trust. The signature analysis is not yet complete, Voss said. I know. Harry looked down at the notebook. But I'm right. Neither Voss nor Pomfrey contradicted him. He slept for 2 hours in the early afternoon, not because he wanted to but because his body simply filed a formal objection and Pomfrey backed it up with the kind of authority that didn't allow for negotiation. He woke to the sound of Ron's voice and Hermione's and a third one he placed after a moment as Fred Weasley's, which was unexpected. He'll want to know, Fred was saying, in the careful low tone of someone trying not to wake a person and not quite committing to the effort. Then tell him when he's actually awake, Ron said. I'm awake, Harry said. Fred appeared around the curtain with the expression of a person who had not expected that to work. Oh, good. He pulled up a chair that he sat on backwards with his arms folded over the backrest. How are you? If one more person asks me that, noted. Fred raised a hand. Different question then. Did you know Madame Pomfrey filed a formal case report with the DMLE this morning? Harry blinked. She said she was going to. Right, but it happened. Fred's expression was doing something complicated. Because the thing is, my dad sent another owl, to Mum and Ron both, this time, which means he's worried about it landing wrong if only Ron knows and Mum didn't. He says 2 senior people from the Magical Crimes Against Persons office are coming to Hogwarts on Thursday. He paused. He also says, and this is the bit that's making him nervous, the case file was flagged when it went in. Someone at the DMLE flagged it as requiring director-level review before investigation proceeds. What does that mean? Ron asked. It means someone high up got notified faster than a standard case would warrant, and then used their authority to slow the normal intake process. Fred said it straightforwardly, as though he was reading from a manual, and Harry could see the effort behind the straightforwardness. Dad says that happens when a case is politically sensitive. When the people it might implicate are people with, he stopped. You know. Powerful friends, Hermione said flatly. Or are powerful friends, Fred said. He looked at Harry directly. I wanted you to know because it happened today and because I think you should know the shape of what you're dealing with before Thursday. Harry looked at him for a moment. Fred Weasley, who was usually performing something, who had a specific brand of constant ironic energy that he wore like a second set of robes, was not performing anything right now. He was just looking at Harry with a clear, direct, concerned expression that Fred didn't usually let sit on his face long enough for people to notice it. Thank you, Harry said. Really? Fred nodded. He stood and flipped the chair back around. At the door he paused. For what it's worth, and I know it's not worth much, George and I are in. Whatever you need. Running information, watching people, being aggressively present in spaces where we make people uncomfortable. He managed a partial version of his usual grin. That last one we're genuinely expert at. He left. Ron exhaled. The flagging thing, he said. That's bad. It's information, Harry said. It tells us who to look at. He picked up the notebook. Someone politically significant enough to have director-level access used their influence to slow down a criminal investigation into the obliviation of a child. That's not a cautious person. That's a frightened one. Hermione was already at the small desk in the corner of the ward with 3 books and a quill and a look of absolute focused intensity. I'm cross-referencing the timing of the confirmed non-dark castings with public records of magical events and ministry appointments in the early 80s, she said without looking up. If the non-dark caster had some kind of official access, some reason to be in and around Harry's family, there may be a record of proximity. She paused. It's a long shot. It's the right kind of long shot, Harry said. That's what I thought. McGonagall came at 3 with a tray of proper food that was better than anything the hospital wing usually produced, which Harry suspected was her way of saying several things she wasn't ready to say out loud. She sat in the chair and watched him eat and asked about the morning's treatment with the tone of someone who was asking because she needed information, not because she was making conversation. Harry told her about the garden. About his mother. About his father on the floor with the toy broomstick. Something happened in McGonagall's face that was seismic and brief, and she turned toward the window before it finished. When she turned back she was composed, but less than she usually was, and she didn't seem to be hiding it the way she would normally have hid it. I taught your mother, she said. In this school. She was in Gryffindor, outstanding student, extraordinary natural talent in transfiguration, but what you'd remember about her, if you were in class with her, was the laugh. She said it as though she was placing a very specific, very carefully kept object down on a table. You have it, she added. Not the same, yours is quieter. But the quality of it. Harry looked at her. I didn't know that, he said. No, McGonagall said. You wouldn't. They both sat with the weight of that. McGonagall, Harry said. Did you ever have any reason to think, when I was placed with the Dursleys, did Dumbledore tell you anything about, he told me it was for your safety, she said. That the blood protection required your mother's family. That you would be protected there in ways that couldn't be replicated elsewhere. She paused. I argued against it. I'd watched the Dursleys for a day and I thought, she stopped. What I thought is irrelevant now. I was overruled. She folded her hands. But no. He didn't tell me about any enchantments beyond the blood protection. He didn't tell me about anything that sounded like what Madame Pomfrey found. Do you think he knew? McGonagall was very quiet. I think Albus Dumbledore, she said at last, has lived so long with the practice of deciding what people need to know that he has sometimes struggled to locate the line between protecting someone and controlling the information about them. She said it with the precise, pained care of someone who loves the person they're criticizing. Whether that extends to knowingly concealing criminal activity, no. I don't believe that. But the space between knowing everything and asking the right questions is where a great deal of harm tends to live. Harry nodded. I want to ask him something, he said. In person. Tomorrow, if possible. I'll arrange it, McGonagall said immediately. The fourth memory from the potion surfaced on its own at 5:30. He hadn't expected it. Voss had said the effects could continue for hours after the initial dose, but he'd been awake and moving, sitting in the chair by the window watching the last of the afternoon, and he'd had no warning before it came. He was older in this one. 7, maybe 8. And he was at Privet Drive, the kitchen, the particular pattern of the linoleum floor that he knew down to his bones. But the memory had a different quality than the cottage ones, a different temperature. He was standing near the back door and Aunt Petunia was at the sink and he was watching her and she was, rigid. Tight. Looking at the washing up with the intense focus of someone who was trying very hard not to look at something else. Harry looked at what she was trying not to look at. A man in the sitting room doorway. He couldn't see the face was the gap, the hole where the erasure had been, but he could see the robes. Wizarding robes, dark gray, neat. He could see the hands. The wand, not raised, held loosely, the way you hold a wand when you want people to understand you could raise it but currently aren't. Petunia was afraid. Petunia knew this man. Petunia was in the room watching him talk to Harry like she'd been told to stay in the room and she was doing it and she hated it. The man in the doorway said something to Harry. He couldn't hear the words, but he could feel the shape of them, something reassuring. Something careful and kind. Harry at 7 believed the reassuring thing completely. And then the wand came up. The fragment tore and he was back in the ward chair with his hands gripping the armrests and the late afternoon sun cold on his face and a cold and absolute certainty sitting in the center of his chest. This person had come to Privet Drive. More than once, the feeling of the memory was not the feeling of a first time. The Dursleys knew this person. Were afraid of this person, or of what this person represented. And this person had been coming to Privet Drive regularly, throughout Harry's childhood at Privet Drive, and obliviating him, and Aunt Petunia had watched it happen. He picked up the notebook and wrote fast before the clarity faded. He wrote everything, the linoleum, Petunia's rigid shoulders, the grey robes, the relaxed grip on the wand, the reassuring words. He wrote not afraid of this person even though something wrong. Trusted him even then. Even knowing the wand was coming. He underlined, Petunia knows. Petunia watched. Petunia was told to stay. He looked at the last line for a moment. Then he wrote something he hadn't let himself write until now, until this specific weight of evidence made it unavoidable. He wrote it because the evidence required it and because not writing it was a kind of dishonesty he didn't have the patience for. He wrote, could be Dumbledore. He looked at it. He didn't add anything. He didn't need to. He put the cap on his quill and closed the notebook and sat in the cooling afternoon and thought about a man who loved him. He was fairly certain of that. Actually, Dumbledore's care for him was one of the few things that had felt genuine from the beginning, and about how the love of someone who believed they were always acting for the greater good could produce the exact same damage as no love at all. Ron came back from dinner with food wrapped in napkins and the intelligence that Professor Snape had cancelled his evening detention session with 2 fourth years, which was extraordinary enough to have made an impression on the general Hogwarts gossip network. Hermione came back with 3 additional books and the information that she'd found 2 potentially relevant references in the cross-referencing exercise and needed to access the library's sealed historical periodicals section to verify them, which she was planning to address in the morning. They ate together in the hospital wing in the particular comfortable silence of people who have been through something significant together and don't need to fill it. Harry said, I need to tell you both something. And I need to tell you that it's a working theory, not a conclusion, because I don't have enough evidence yet to make it a conclusion and I don't want to get there before the evidence does. Ron and Hermione looked at him. The figure in the memory, he said. The one who came to my bedroom at night when I was 3. The one who came to Privet Drive while Petunia watched. He paused. I know how it feels. I know the quality of it. And I need you both to understand that I could be wrong, the memories are fragmented, the faces are the gap, I don't have a name. He looked at both of them steadily. But I think the non-dark caster might be someone close to Hogwarts. Someone I already know. And I think whoever flagged the DMLE case file today did it because they're already scared. Hermione put down her fork. Dumbledore, she said quietly. Not a question. Theory, Harry said. Yes, Hermione said. But a good one. She was very still for a moment. If it's him, Harry, if it's him, that changes everything. Not just about you. About how this school operates. About who makes decisions about who and why. I know. And she stopped. We'd be 12 years old making a case against the most powerful wizard in Britain. 13, Ron said. I'm 13. My birthday was, you're 12, Hermione said. Your birthday isn't until March. Close enough, it's not close enough, you're 12, can we, Harry said, focus on the part where I potentially have evidence that the headmaster of my school has been coming to my relative's house and erasing my memories since I was an infant? A pause. Sorry, Hermione said. Right, Ron said. Yes. More important. He looked at Harry with the particular expression he wore when he was thinking harder than he usually let people see. If it is him, he won't try to bury it. That's not, he'd know that's not survivable if it comes out and he tried to hide it after you asked directly. He's too clever for that. He picked up his napkin and put it down again. But he might try to explain it in a way that makes it seem necessary, Harry finished. He'll have a reason. He always has a reason. Yeah. Ron looked at him. And the reason might even be a good one. That's the complicated part, isn't it? Harry thought about his father on the floor of the sitting room with the spinning cork and the floating toy broomstick and the absolute unself-conscious joy of the moment. He thought about the echo of his mother's laugh. He thought about 42 holes where pieces of himself had lived. Whatever the reason, he said, it wasn't good enough. Neither Ron nor Hermione argued with that. Snape came at 9. Harry had not expected Snape to come at all, let alone at 9 at night, and when the door to the ward opened and the distinctive silhouette filled it, he felt a very specific and complicated alertness move through him, not fear, or not only fear. The alertness of someone who has been thinking a great deal about a person and has just been given unexpectedly direct access to them. Pomfrey intercepted Snape at the ward door with a look that said quite clearly that she hadn't authorized this visit and was deciding whether to eject him, and Snape said something low and brief that Harry couldn't hear, and Pomfrey's expression shifted into something tight and reluctant before she stepped aside. Snape walked the length of the ward with his usual quality of moving through space as though it owed him something, and stopped at the foot of Harry's bed. He looked at Ron and Hermione with an expression that was neutral in the pointed way that is still somehow a directive. I'm not leaving, Ron said pleasantly. Snape's gaze moved to Harry. Harry said nothing. He waited. The signature analysis, Snape said. He said it with the clipped efficiency of someone who had decided to do something and had not decided to decorate the doing of it with any softening. Healer Voss's preliminary attribution report. I've reviewed it. How did you get access to that? Hermione asked. Because I was asked to review it by Albus Dumbledore, who believed, correctly, that a former Death Eater's ability to interpret dark casting signatures with specificity might be of use in the investigation. He looked at Harry steadily. Of the 14 dark attributed castings, I can identify the specific practitioners responsible for 11 of them. Not guess. Not infer. Identify with certainty based on the signature's specific features, which vary between individual casters in ways that are as distinct as handwriting. Harry stared at him. You know who 11 of the Death Eaters were, he said. I know who 11 of the Death Eaters are, Snape said, with a very quiet and very deliberate emphasis on the tense. Several are in Azkaban. Several are not. He paused. The architecture of the Death Eater castings follows a logic. They were not chaotic or random, they were targeted at specific memory clusters. Clusters associated with early magical development and, based on the positioning, instinctive defensive responses. His voice was flat and professional, and underneath it, Harry thought, something else. Something that was being very carefully not shown. Someone instructed Death Eaters to suppress your instinctive magical responses. Systematically. The purpose was to ensure that when you eventually faced, he stopped. The purpose was to create a limitation. A version of you that was less than you should be. On Voldemort's orders, Harry said. Yes. And the other castings? The non-dark signatures. A pause. 3 of the remaining castings, Snape said, are not attributable with certainty from the report as written. One of those 3 bears a signature consistent with, "I've given Dumbledore my analysis." He stopped and the stop felt deliberate. "There are things I'm not positioned to tell you tonight. I want you to understand that is not a permanent condition. There are processes, Snape." Harry kept his voice level. "I already have a working theory. I'd rather confirm or deny it than keep circling it." Snape looked at him for a long moment. "Your theory," Snape said, "is probably correct in its essentials and incorrect in some of its details." He said it like it cost something. "The details matter. When you meet with the headmaster tomorrow, ask him about the interval between your birth and October 1981. Ask him what he was worried about and what he was told. Ask him by whom. He let that sit. He will answer you honestly because he is incapable of sustained dishonesty with someone he loves, and because he knows, I believe he knows, that the time for managed information has passed." He turned to go. "Snape," Harry said. Snape stopped. "Didn't turn." "The 11 you can identify," Harry said. "One of them is Lucius Malfoy." A silence that was too long to be neutral. "Yes," Snape said. "He is among them. He left." The ward was very quiet. Ron let out a long breath through his nose. "Lucius Malfoy," he said. "He'd have been taking orders from Voldemort," Harry said. "Even after Halloween. Something Voldemort wanted done that the Death Eaters carried on with, Harry," Hermione said. Her voice had a quality that made him look at her immediately. She was staring at her notebook. She'd been writing through the whole exchange, he realized. The scratch of her quill had been continuous. "The cross-referencing I was doing this afternoon. I found a record, it's partial and I need to verify it, but, there's a reference in a 1979 Ministry journal to a certified Obliviator performing a non-sanctioned evaluation visit to a private residence in the company of a senior official. The residence isn't named. The official isn't named. But the Obliviator's certification number is logged." She looked up. "And the date matches the window for one of the early non-dark castings." Harry looked at her. "An official Obliviator," he said. "Sent with a senior official to a private residence in 1979. 2 years before Halloween. While my parents were alive and I was an infant." He thought about the grey robes, the relaxed wand grip. "That's not a Death Eater. That's Ministry sanctioned." "Or using Ministry credentials without sanction," Hermione said. "The record is ambiguous. But someone with access. Someone with significant access," she said. "And the kind of credibility that lets you walk into a baby's bedroom and walk back out again without anyone stopping you." Harry thought about Dumbledore saying parties I believe trustworthy and the way he'd said it, the specific weight of the phrase, the grief underneath it that Harry had caught and filed away. "I was told, by parties I believed trustworthy." Maybe that wasn't Dumbledore protecting himself from responsibility. Maybe it was something simpler and sadder, a man who had been lied to by someone he trusted, and had paid for that trust in a currency he was only beginning to understand. Maybe the figure in the grey robes wasn't Dumbledore at all. He added that to the notebook. He added a question mark next to the line that said could be Dumbledore. He didn't cross it out. Outside the ward windows, the lake caught the moonlight in fragments, broken and reshaping with every shift of the water, and the castle was dark except for the towers, where lights burned in rooms where people who carried secrets sat with them through the night. Harry looked at the notebook and thought, tomorrow I will sit in front of Albus Dumbledore and I will ask him the questions that Snape said to ask, and whatever answers come, I will hear them, and I will measure them, and I will not let kindness substitute for truth. He looked at the question mark. He looked at the window. He looked at his own hands, and thought about what Pomfrey had said, your instinctive responses were harder to touch. Everything else at reduced capacity. But the hands that had reached for a spinning cork before he could talk, the hands that had wrapped around a broomstick at 11 with the certainty of something coming home, those had always been his. They'd tried to take everything else. But they hadn't been able to touch what he did without thinking. He closed the notebook. He went to sleep. Chapter 4. The architecture of a lie. Dumbledore's office smelled like lemon drops and old parchment and something beneath both of those that Harry couldn't name, something that might have been the accumulated weight of decades of difficult decisions living in the walls. McGonagall had walked him up herself, which he hadn't expected, and at the gargoyle she'd said the password, sherbet lemon, with the brisk precision of someone who had said it 10,000 times and still didn't entirely approve of it, and then she'd looked at Harry for a moment before he stepped onto the moving stair. Whatever he tells you, she'd said, you are permitted to feel however you feel about it. You don't have to manage that for anyone else's comfort. Including his. I know, Harry said. She'd looked at him like she wasn't sure he did know, but also like she respected that he'd said it. He went up alone. The office was already open when he reached the top of the stair. Dumbledore was standing at the window that looked out over the grounds, west-facing, catching the morning sun as it came over the castle's east towers and turned the lake below into hammered silver. He turned when Harry came in and gestured to the chair across from his desk with a kind of quiet formality that was different from his usual manner. Less performance. Less warmth deployed as management. Harry sat. Dumbledore sat. Fawkes, on his perch in the corner, made a sound like a single-struck bell and went quiet. Snape told me what he said to you, Dumbledore said. He didn't open with anything else. I asked him to speak with you, and he was more forthcoming than I anticipated, a brief pause. Which I should have expected of him, perhaps. He told me to ask you about the interval between my birth and Halloween 1981, Harry said. He told me to ask what you were worried about and what you were told and by whom. Yes. Dumbledore folded his hands on the desk. The sunlight caught the silver in his beard and turned it briefly gold. I am going to tell you everything I know, Harry. I want to preface it by saying that everything I did from love and from what I believed was sound judgment, and I understand, now, the distinction between those two things and how dangerously easy it is to conflate them. Okay, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him with a complicated expression, something that held both the reality of Harry as a 12-year-old boy across a desk and something else, something that Harry recognized was a reckoning the man had been carrying since yesterday. When you were born, Dumbledore began, Voldemort was ascendant. Not yet at the height of his power, but building, and the Death Eaters were active, organized, and systematically targeting potential threats to his eventual dominance. In the summer of 1980, a prophecy was made. He said this with the matter-of-factness of a man delivering information he has decided not to soften. You know of prophecies, I assume, the nature of them, the weight given to them by those who believe in such things. The one about me, Harry said. The one that says I have power he doesn't know. Something moved across Dumbledore's face. You know about the prophecy. I didn't until just now, Harry said. But that's the shape of it, isn't it? Something that marks me as dangerous to him. That's why the Death Eaters were suppressing my magical development. Someone told them about it. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. The prophecy was overheard, he said. A portion of it. By a spy. Who? A pause that Harry was beginning to be able to read, the kind Dumbledore used not to evade but to measure, to assess whether the full truth was something the person across from him was ready for. And Harry felt, sitting in that pause, a low quiet anger that had nothing to do with heat. He was 12 years old and this man was still instinctively assessing what he could handle. Who? Harry said again, steadily. Severus Snape, Dumbledore said. The name landed. Harry sat with it. He was a Death Eater then, Harry said. Yes. He brought the partial prophecy to Voldemort. He didn't know, at the time, that the subject of the prophecy was the son of a woman Dumbledore stopped. He didn't know it would be your family. When he understood, he came to me. That act of conscience is why your parents were warned, were given the chance to hide. It is also why, when your parents died and Snape survived, I believed his remorse was genuine. He held Harry's gaze. I still believe that. The prophecy is why the Death Eaters were obliviating me, Harry said. Voldemort wanted to, what? Reduce me? Make sure when the time came I wasn't what I was supposed to be. Yes. Dumbledore's voice was level and grave. Lucius Malfoy, acting on standing orders from Voldemort, coordinated a program of suppressive obliviation targeting your early development. The intention was to ensure that if Voldemort fell and later returned, the child marked as his potential equal would be diminished. Limited. He paused. 14 of the castings were Death Eater work. That is the criminal strand of this story and it will be pursued through the DMLE. Lucius Malfoy will face significant legal consequences. And the other castings, Harry said. Dumbledore was quiet. Tell me, Harry said. All of it. You said everything you know. Yes. Dumbledore picked up a small object from his desk, a brass instrument that turned slowly in his fingers, something meditative in the handling of it. In 1979, I became aware that Death Eater agents had been accessing you, had established a pattern of entry to your parents' home, using the cover of trusted faces and falsified ministry credentials. Your father's best friend, Sirius Black, was the one who discovered it first. He set the instrument down. We were in a state of active war, Harry. I cannot overstate the precariousness of the situation. We had no certainty that your parents' location was fully secure. We had no certainty that the people around them were all trustworthy. We were working against an enemy with extraordinary reach and he stopped. Harry waited. I made a decision, Dumbledore said. In the spring of 1980, 3 months before your birth, I authorized a single targeted obliviation to be placed on your parents' residence, a charm that would, in the event that a Death Eater agent successfully accessed the building and tampered with your memory, prevent the deepest layers of your developing magical architecture from being permanently disrupted. He said it carefully, precisely, in the tone of a man who has rehearsed the words and has discovered that they don't change the thing. It was intended as a protective measure. A lock on the foundation so that whatever the Death Eaters removed, the essential structure remained. Harry was very still. That's one, he said. Yes. Dumbledore met his eyes. That is one. Cast on you 3 months before your birth, targeted on your mother while you were in utero, designed to create a baseline magical resilience that Death Eater tampering couldn't reach. He paused. The casting was performed by a certified obliviator under my direction, in your parents' home, with your mother and father present and aware of what was being done. Another pause. Hermione Granger will find the record of that visit in the Ministry's historical files if she hasn't already. I suspect she is very close. My parents knew, Harry said. About that one, yes. They were not happy with the decision. Your father in particular felt it was an unacceptable intrusion. But they trusted me, and I believed I was right, and, he stopped. And I was wrong. Not about the intention. But about what I had the right to do, even with intention, without your parents' full understanding of the long-term effect. The long-term effect. A targeted obliviation on a developing magical architecture, Dumbledore said, creates a signature pattern in the memory structure. A shape. What I didn't anticipate, what the obliviator I engaged failed to adequately model, is that this signature pattern interacted with the Death Eater castings in an unexpected way. Instead of protecting the foundation from their tampering, it essentially provided them a template. A map. His voice was very quiet now. The structure I placed to protect you became, in part, the structure they used to target you with greater precision. Harry heard this. He let it sit. He felt the anger in his chest reorganize itself, which was a strange sensation. It didn't diminish, it just found a different shape. Cleaner. More architectural. You tried to protect me, Harry said. And it made the damage worse. In effect. Yes. Dumbledore didn't look away. That is the truth of it. And I have been sitting with that truth since Madame Pomfrey told me what she found, and I am not going to minimize it for you or offer you comfortable context that softens what it means. He folded his hands. I cost you. My decision cost you. I don't know precisely how much, the analysis continues, but it cost you. That is mine to carry. Harry looked at him. He looked at him for a long time, this man who had met him at King's Cross in his imagination and sent him letters, and looked at him with that particular grave twinkle that was both warm and measuring all at once. He looked at the man who had put him in a cupboard under the stairs, at least in the decision-making sense, who had placed him with the Dursleys and told himself it was protection and not examined it closely enough to see what it actually was. He thought about what McGonagall had said on the stair. You are permitted to feel however you feel about it. He was angry. He was going to stay angry for a while. That seemed right and proportionate, and he wasn't going to apologize for it. But underneath the anger was something more complicated, the understanding that the man across from him was not a villain in grey robes performing the villain's justification speech. He was a person who had made a disastrous call with genuinely good intentions and was sitting with the full consequence of it without flinching. And that, the not flinching, mattered to Harry, even now. The other castings, Harry said. After my parents died. After Halloween. You were managing my placement at the Dursleys, you were checking on me sometimes. I checked on you 3 times in your childhood, Dumbledore said. The first when you were 4, the second when you were 7, the third when you were 9. He paused. Each time I visited, I found a child who was, the living conditions were not what I had hoped. The Dursleys' treatment was not what I had envisioned when I placed you there. He met Harry's eyes. I told myself the blood protection justified it. I told myself discomfort was preferable to danger. He stopped. I also told myself that if you knew the full nature of what surrounded you, the Death Eater program, the prophecy, the weight of expectation, it would be a burden a child couldn't bear. So you obliviated me, Harry said. I cast a single charm, Dumbledore said. Once. When you were 7. He said it without deflection. You had, on my 3rd visit, you said something to me. Something that indicated that the Death Eater castings had been incomplete, that certain memories were persisting, fragments, which had made you aware that things were being done to you, that something was wrong with your own mind. His voice was very controlled. You were 7 years old and you said to me, you said, why do things go missing from inside my head? The ward. The notebook. Why do things go missing from inside my head? Harry was 7 years old saying that. I panicked, Dumbledore said, and the word panicked from Albus Dumbledore in that quiet room was one of the strangest things Harry had ever heard. Not from malice. From fear. I was afraid that if you were aware of the tampering, at 7, alone with the Dursleys, with no magical education and no framework, I was afraid the awareness would damage you more than the gaps would. He looked at his hands briefly and then back up. I cast a single charm that removed the specific awareness of the previous castings. The memory of asking me that question. The associated distress. He paused. It was the worst decision I made. Worse than the original protective cast. Because by then you were old enough that the casting left a visible trace, and because what I removed was your own perception of your own mind's damage. I removed your ability to tell that something had been done to you. Harry sat in the absolute quiet of that. He was aware of his own breathing. He was aware of Fawkes shifting on his perch. He was aware of the morning light on the desk and the slow turning of the brass instrument and the silence of the office around them. You took away my ability to know I'd been hurt, Harry said. Yes. One word. Dumbledore didn't dress it up. Because you decided a 7-year-old couldn't handle knowing. Yes. You made that decision for me. Yes. Harry stood up. He stood up because sitting suddenly felt impossible, not because he was going to do anything, he wasn't going to shout or throw something, he just needed to be vertical, needed the physical shift of it. He walked to the window, the one Dumbledore had been standing at when Harry came in, and looked out over the grounds. The lake was silver in the morning light. The grounds were empty at this hour. The Olary sat on its tower to the right, and a few white specks moved against the sky, owls returning from night runs. He stood there for a moment and breathed. The 42nd, he said. The most recent one. 14 months ago. That was not mine, Dumbledore said, from behind him. His voice was careful and clear. I want to be absolutely certain you hear me on that. I cast one, at 7. The Obliviation performed 14 months before your arrival at Hogwarts was not my doing. Harry turned. Whose? I am not certain. The signature analysis is ongoing. What I know is that 14 months before your Hogwarts letter, someone with high-level access to Ministry channels and, I believe, knowledge of both the prophecy and the prior casting program, performed a highly sophisticated Obliviation. One that I believe was designed, he stopped. Healer Voss described it to me this morning as the most technically accomplished of all 42. Precise. Layered. Designed to target not what you remembered, but what you were beginning to become. Harry frowned. What I was beginning to become. At 10 years old, Dumbledore said, the magical suppressions were beginning to fail. The Death Eater castings have a half-life. They were designed for a young child's architecture, and as you approached adolescence and your natural magical development accelerated, they were losing coherence. You were beginning to show signs. He looked at Harry carefully. What happened to you on that broomstick, Harry? The fall, the loss of consciousness, that was not illness. That was your own suppressed magical architecture encountering the dissolving upper layers and producing a surge that your central nervous system couldn't manage because it had never been trained to manage it. You fell because something in you was waking up. He paused. The 42nd casting was an attempt to stop that process. Someone who knew you were coming into your power decided to take one final, comprehensive run at stopping it. The room was very quiet. Someone who knew about the prophecy, Harry said slowly. Who had Ministry access. Who was technically accomplished enough to cast the most sophisticated charm of the 42. Yes. Someone who isn't in Azkaban, Harry said. Because this was 14 months ago. Yes. Harry looked at him. You have a name. I have a strong suspicion, Dumbledore said. And I will not give you that name today. Not because I want to protect the person, I don't, not anymore, but because we need the signature analysis to be complete and verified before a name is attached. Because you are about to go in front of a DMLE investigation and I will not have you acting on my suspicion before it is substantiated, for your sake and for the integrity of the case. His voice was very clear and very direct. I am not managing you, Harry. I am being strategically precise on your behalf. There is a difference. Harry looked at him for a long moment. You said everything you know, Harry said. I said I would tell you everything I know. I have told you everything I know. What I have not given you is a name I'm not yet certain of. He held Harry's gaze. Two different things. Harry breathed through his nose. He thought about what Ron had said. The reason might even be a good one. That's the complicated part. Thursday, Harry said. The DMLE investigators come Thursday. Will the signature analysis be complete by then? I've asked Healer Voss to prioritize it. A pause. Yes. By Thursday morning. And you'll give me the name. You'll have the name before Thursday morning, yes. Harry nodded. He moved back to the chair and sat back down. He put his hands on the desk, flat, and looked at Dumbledore. I need to say something, he said. And I need you to hear it completely. Of course. I understand that you loved my parents. I understand that you were trying to protect me. I understand the war, and the prophecy, and the genuine impossible difficulty of the position you were in. He said it clearly, each clause given its weight. None of that means what you did was acceptable. It wasn't. You made a choice, One choice, even setting aside the protective cast before my birth, one choice, to reach into a 7-year-old child's head and remove his awareness of his own damage. And the result is that I spent the next 5 years not knowing something was wrong with me. Not having language for the way I felt. Not being able to ask for help because you took away the very thing that would have made me ask. He looked at Dumbledore's hands, then back at his face. I'm not going to forgive you right now. It's not something I can do right now. Maybe later. But right now I need you to know that I'm going to ask you for things in this investigation, and I'm going to expect complete answers, and the days of you deciding what I can handle are finished. Dumbledore held his gaze throughout. When Harry finished, Dumbledore said nothing for a moment. And then, yes. Just that. You are entirely right. And I am sorry, Harry. Not in the way that is intended to end a conversation. In the way that means I understand the weight of what I did, and I accept the consequences, and I will spend whatever time I have left being something more useful to you than a well-meaning obstacle. He paused. Beginning now. Good, Harry said. They looked at each other across the desk. Fawkes made a sound like water moving over stones. Tell me about the prophecy, Harry said. All of it. He was in the office for 2 hours. He came down the moving stair afterward and found McGonagall waiting at the bottom, not standing there looking purposeful, just leaning against the wall with her arms folded, looking out the window across from the gargoyle, which he thought was her version of trying to appear casual and not quite managing it. She looked at his face. Well, she said. He told me. Harry stopped at the bottom of the stair. The corridor was empty, classes were in session, the castle around them industriously academic. He cast one. At 7. The protective cast before my birth that was different, that wasn't, he worked through it. That was a different category of wrong. The one at 7 was the worst one. He admits that. McGonagall's jaw worked briefly. And the 42nd? The most recent? Not him. He doesn't know who yet, he claims. He'll have a name by Thursday. Harry paused. I believe him. About not knowing. I think he's genuinely, he stopped, not because the thought was unclear but because the word for it was complicated. He's been carrying something for 12 years that he thought he'd managed and it's turned out to be considerably heavier than he thought. McGonagall looked at him with an expression he was starting to be able to read as her version of something close to pride, though she'd have absolutely denied it if he said so. You handled that with remarkable composure, she said. I told him I wasn't forgiving him right now. That is remarkable composure. Harry almost managed a laugh. Can I go back to classes today? She looked at him with the particular McGonagall assessment that factored in approximately 30 separate variables simultaneously. Tomorrow, she said. Pomfrey said, Madame Pomfrey agreed to one more day. You need to eat properly and rest and not exert yourself magically. She turned and began walking. Come to my office. I have sandwiches and I want you to tell me everything he told you about the prophecy. He went back to the hospital wing at 4. Hermione was vibrating. She was trying not to be, but Hermione vibrating was a specific and recognizable state involving very rapid blinking, the inability to sit fully back in her chair, and a quality of containment that suggested something was pressing very hard against the inside of it looking for a gap. Ron looked at Harry and then at Hermione and said, she found something at lunch. She won't tell me until you're here. She's been like this for 3 hours. I have not been, Hermione stopped. I found something. Tell me, Harry said. He was barely in the door. She opened the notebook, her notebook, the research one, not the one she'd given him, and turned it to face him. She'd made a table. Hermione tables were things of precision and beauty, with ruled lines and labeled columns and a color-coding system that he suspected had internal logic he wasn't fully equipped to appreciate. The Ministry Historical Periodicals, she said. I got access this morning through Madame Pants. I told her it was for an advanced history of magic project, which isn't entirely untrue. She pointed to the first column. 9 entries in the records between 1979 and 1984 referencing a certified obliviator conducting visits to private residences under ministry authorization. Most of them are routine. The obliviator office does legitimate work, erasing magical incidents witnessed by muggles, that sort of thing. But 3 of these 9 entries have anomalies. She moved her finger. The residence is listed as private rather than incident site. The authorization chain goes not through the Obliviator standard supervisor but through a separate office, the Office of Magical Emergency Classification. And the authorizing official's name is redacted in all 3 entries. Same official all 3 times. Harry said. Same redaction format. Same authorization code prefix. She looked up. The redaction was added after the original entry. The ink chemistry is different. I checked. Madame Pants showed me how to read the layering, which means someone came along after the initial record was made and removed the name. Someone with access to the historical periodicals archive, Ron said. Someone with very significant access, Hermione said. These are restricted records. You can't just walk in and amend them. You need senior registry clearance. She tapped the column. I cross-referenced the authorization code prefix. OEM prefix. The Office of Magical Emergency Classification. In 1979, 1980, and through to 1984, that office was headed by, she paused, and Harry understood the pause as the particular beat of a person who has checked their conclusion 5 times because it's too significant not to. It was headed by Bartemius Crouch Sr. The ward was very still. Crouch, Harry said. Head of the DMLE by the mid-80s, Hermione said. But before that, head of the Office of Magical Emergency Classification, which had jurisdiction over any situation that could be categorized as a magical emergency affecting civilian security. She looked at Harry directly. Including, potentially, a situation involving the child of a prophecy and a sustained Death Eater access program. Crouch could have framed the Obliviations as a state security measure, Harry said slowly. Made them look official. Used the office's jurisdiction to cover what was actually happening, yes. Hermione sat back. And if Crouch authorized it through his office, those records would be in the OEM archive, not the standard Obliviator files. They'd be harder to find, and, she paused again. And there's one more thing. She turned a page. Bartemius Crouch Sr., as of 14 months ago, was still an active and senior ministry official. 14 months ago. The 42nd casting. Harry sat down on the bed. Ron said, Merlin. He said it quietly and with feeling. It's not conclusive, Hermione said quickly. The redaction could be for other reasons. Crouch could have authorized the OEM visits for entirely legitimate. She stopped, clearly not convincing herself. I need to find the actual OEM archive entries. Dumbledore said he'll have a name for me by Thursday morning, Harry said. He looked at Hermione's table. I think it's going to be Crouch. Why would Crouch want to suppress your magical development? Ron said, frowning. He's not a Death Eater. He's the bloke who sent Death Eaters to Azkaban. He might have been trying to protect me, Harry said. Or he might have had a deal. Or he might have thought a powerful Harry Potter was a dangerous variable in a post-Voldemort world that he was trying to control. He looked at the table. Or he might have been doing something else entirely that we haven't figured out yet. He paused. But the 42nd casting. The most sophisticated one. Targeted at what I was beginning to become. He thought about Dumbledore's words. Someone who knew you were coming into your power decided to take one final, comprehensive run at stopping it. Someone who knew about the prophecy 14 months ago. Who had ministry access. Who was technically accomplished and who needed me limited. If it's Crouch, Hermione said carefully, then the flagged case file, he flagged it, Harry said. Yes. He used director-level access to slow the investigation into his own crime, Ron said, and his voice had gone flat and hard in a way Ron's voice almost never did. That's not just obliviation. That's obstruction. That's a ministry official who is genuinely scared, Harry said. Which means he knows we're getting close. He stood. We need to make sure Thursday happens. The DMLE investigators need to get in front of Dumbledore and the signature analysis and Hermione's records before Crouch has a chance to. He stopped, because the thought was completing itself in a direction he didn't entirely like. He's already tried to flag it. What else can he do between now and Thursday to shut this down? The three of them looked at each other. Dumbledore, Hermione said. He needs to know about Crouch tonight. I know. Harry picked up his cloak from the chair. And McGonagall. And Pomfrey, she's the one who filed the report, she needs to know there's pressure on the investigation from above. He paused. And we need Fred and George watching certain things. Specifically anyone who leaves the castle between now and Thursday. Ron looked at him. You think Crouch might come here? If I were him and I knew a DMLE investigation was coming that I tried and failed to slow down, Harry said, I'd want to know exactly what evidence existed before Thursday. Which means someone would need to access the diagnostic reports. Pomfrey's case notes. Healer Voss's analysis. He looked at the ward door. All of which are currently in a filing cabinet in this room. Pomfrey's head appeared around the door at the exact moment he said it, as though she'd been listening, which, knowing Pomfrey, she probably had been. I have already warded this room, she said crisply. Doberman-class wards on the file cabinet, an Allohammer-resistant lock on the door, and a sneakoscope on the windowsill that will alert me from anywhere in the castle if someone attempts entry without my express authorization. She surveyed the three of them. I have also sent copies of the core diagnostic documents to 2 separate secure addresses outside the school, because I have been doing this for 31 years and I know what frightened powerful people do to evidence. She folded her hands. What else? Harry stared at her. You're brilliant, Ron said. I'm thorough, she corrected. There is a difference. She looked at Harry. Mr. Potter. I understand you've spoken with the headmaster. Yes. I understand he confirmed one casting of his own. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Her expression did the complicated thing he'd been learning to read, the clinical composure processing something that wasn't entirely clinical. He came to see me this afternoon, she said. He sat in that chair and he didn't try to defend himself. He asked what he could do to help. She paused. I told him he could start by never again making a decision about a student's mind without that student's knowledge and consent. What did he say? He said yes. She pulled the door open slightly wider. Dinner will be sent up. Miss Granger, Mr. Weasley, I'll allow you to stay until 9 provided you're not exhausting him. She began to withdraw. Pomfrey, Harry said. She stopped. Thank you. For running the diagnostics. For being angry about it from the beginning. He paused. You didn't have to be angry. You could have just been professional about it. She looked at him for a moment. 12-year-old children, she said precisely, do not require professional. They require human. She went back out and her footsteps receded down the ward, and the door swung quietly shut. They sent Fred and George a note via Hermione's cat, who was an extremely competent messenger and had the added advantage of being able to travel unnoticed through the castle in ways that an owl couldn't. The note asked them to watch specifically for any unfamiliar faces arriving at the castle or any staff members moving between the school and Hogsmeade in the hours between now and Thursday morning. George sent back a note that said, already on it. Also, Filch has been weird. 3rd time we've seen him near the hospital wing corridor tonight. Just thought you'd want to know. Ron looked up from the note. Filch wouldn't. Filch isn't magical, he can't access the files, but he could be watching the corridor, Harry said. Watching who goes in and out. Reporting back. To who? To whoever asked him to. Hermione was already writing a second note. I'm telling Madame Pomfrey. Tell her to move the files, Harry said. Where? To McGonagall's office. He thought about it. Actually, tell her to move them tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Hermione sent the note. Pomfrey's reply came back in 11 minutes, already done. Sleep. The three of them sat in the warm yellow light of the ward and felt, briefly, the precarious satisfaction of people who are doing the right thing and are not entirely sure the right thing is safe. Crouch, Ron said, turning the name over. My dad's met him. Dad says he's a hard man. Absolutely certain he's always right. He looked at Harry. He sent his own son to Azkaban. For being a Death Eater. His own kid. He prioritizes what he thinks is right over everything else, Harry said. Including his family. He looked at the window, at the dark outside it. A man like that, with ministry authority and absolute conviction that he knows best, he'd justify anything. Including what he did to me, if he thought it protected something he valued. What did he think it protected? Hermione asked. Maybe the ministry's version of the post-war world, Harry said. Maybe the narrative that Voldemort is gone and the threat is over and there's no prophecy and no chosen anyone and everything is fine. He paused. If I start coming into the power I'm supposed to have, if I show up at Hogwarts at 11 and immediately start doing things that shouldn't be possible for an 11-year-old, people ask questions. Someone figures out about the prophecy. The whole careful structure Crouch has built starts shaking. He looked at Hermione. What does a man like that do when his careful structure starts shaking? He shores it up, she said. By any means available. Including one last obliviation, Harry said, on a 10-year-old boy who was starting to wake up. The ward was very quiet. Outside, clouds moved across the moon and the lake went dark and then silvered again as they passed, and the castle sat enormous and ancient, and for the first time in 3 days Harry didn't feel like a patient in it. He felt like something else. Something that was taking shape. He picked up the notebook and wrote, Bartemius Crouch Sr. 42nd casting. Flagged DMLE case file. Obstruction. Full investigation required. He underlined Crouch's name 3 times. He looked at the notebook for a moment. Then he wrote, underneath everything else, something that wasn't a theory or a lead or an investigative note. He wrote it because it was the truest thing he currently knew and he wanted it recorded somewhere permanent. I'm going to be everything they tried to stop me from being. He capped the quill. He put the notebook on the bedside table and lay back and closed his eyes. Tomorrow, back to classes. Thursday, the DMLE. The signature analysis. The name. He thought about the figure at the ministry with absolute conviction and ministry access and a wand that came up over a sleeping 10-year-old child with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this before. He thought about his mother in the garden. He thought about his father on the floor with the spinning cork. He breathed. He went to sleep. Down in the dungeons, Severus Snape sat at his desk with the signature analysis in front of him and a quill in his hand that he hadn't used for 20 minutes. He was looking at a notation in the bottom corner of the 3rd page. The notation said what he'd known it would say. He'd known for 2 days. He picked up the quill. He wrote one sentence on a separate piece of parchment. He folded it and addressed it and placed it in the tray that his owl collected at midnight. The sentence said, the 42nd casting carries Crouch's personal signature. I will testify to that. He put down the quill. He looked at the analysis for another long moment. Then he blew out the lamp and sat in the dark for a while before going to bed. Chapter 5. The 42nd Thursday came in gray and purposeful, the sky the color of unpolished pewter and the wind off the lake sharp enough to make the castle windows rattle in their frames. Harry was back in his dormitory by then. Pomfrey had released him Wednesday evening with a strengthening potion, a list of instructions, and the particular expression of someone who was releasing a patient against their better instincts but understood the patient was going to do what they were going to do regardless. He woke at 6 and lay in the dark listening to Ron breathe and Neville turn over in his sleep and Seamus mumble something that might have been Quidditch related, and he thought about the day clearly and without panic, the way you think about something you've been building toward and can now finally see in its full shape. The DMLE investigators were arriving at 9. Dumbledore had sent a note at 11 the previous night, slipped under the dormitory door, which meant he'd either walked up himself or sent someone he trusted completely, and Harry chose to believe the former. The note said, "The signature analysis is complete. Snape's independent attestation has been confirmed by Healer Voss. The name is Bartemius Crouch Sr. I will ensure you have the full documented analysis before your meeting this morning. I am sorry it took me this long to be entirely honest with you. A.D." Harry had read it twice, folded it, and put it in the notebook. He got up at 6:30 and dressed in the dark without waking anyone, took the notebook and his wand, and went down to the common room, which was empty at this hour except for a fifth year he didn't know asleep in an armchair near the fire with a potions textbook on his chest. Harry sat in the window seat and watched the grounds lighten from black to grey and wrote down everything he was going to say. Not a script, just a skeleton. The shape of what needed to be established. He was still there when Ron appeared at 7:30, Harry doing something remarkable, carrying 2 cups of tea from somewhere. "How long have you been up?" Ron said. "Since 6. Ron sat across from him and put one of the cups on the window seat between them without being asked. "Are you nervous?" Harry considered this honestly. "No," he said. "Not about the investigators." "About what then?" "About what happens after." He looked at the grounds, at the lake catching the first pale light. "If it's Crouch." "When it's Crouch." "He's a senior ministry official. He was head of the DMLE. He has friends, he has influence, he's spent decades building a particular reputation." He paused. "People aren't going to want to believe it." Ron was quiet for a moment. "My dad believes it," he said. "I sent him another note last night. Told him the name. He wrote back in an hour." He reached into his robe pocket and produced a folded note. "He says Crouch has been acting strangely for the past year. Erratic. Missing meetings. And he says there have been rumors, nothing formal, nothing provable, that Crouch has been covering something, some investigation into a ministry irregularity from the early 80s, and he couldn't figure out what it was." He put the note on the window seat. "He says if the signature analysis is solid, it won't matter how many friends Crouch has. Some things are too big to absorb. I hope he's right." "My dad is usually right about people," Ron said. "He's wrong about Muggles sometimes, he thinks everything they make is brilliant, which is excessive, but about people he's pretty good." Harry picked up the tea. It was hot and strong and exactly right. Hermione arrived at 8 with a leather satchel that contained, Harry learned when she opened it, copies of every piece of research she'd compiled over the past 4 days, organized by chronology and cross-referenced by subject, which she'd apparently been up until midnight producing. "They'll have their own documentation," Harry said. "They'll have whatever they've been given through official channels," Hermione said. "Which has been subject to a director-level flag. Our documentation is independent." She set a copy in front of Harry and kept one herself. "You don't go into a DMLE interview without your own records." "Right," Harry said. "Also I wrote a summary," she said. "A 1-page summary of the key findings. Investigators appreciate brevity if it's accurate brevity." Ron looked at her. "When did you sleep?" "I slept," she said, in a tone that didn't fully confirm the quantity. Dumbledore met Harry outside the hospital wing at 8:30 with a sealed envelope that he placed in Harry's hands with both of his, which was unusual for Dumbledore and therefore meant something. The envelope contained the full signature analysis, Voss's documentation and Snape's independent attestation, both on official St. Mungo's parchment, and a single handwritten note from Dumbledore that named Crouch, cited the specific casting evidence, and offered his own testimony as supporting witness, signed with the full weight of whatever his signature still carried. Harry looked at the signature. Then he looked up at Dumbledore. "I'll be in the meeting," Dumbledore said. "If you want me there." "Yes," Harry said immediately. Not because he needed the support, though he'd have been dishonest to say he didn't want it, but because Dumbledore's testimony was going to be critical and because having Dumbledore present and accountable felt important. Felt like the beginning of a different way things worked between them. "Yes, I want you there." Dumbledore nodded. Something in his expression, the particular set of it, was different from anything Harry had seen on him before. Less the comfortable certainty of the man who always knew what the chessboard looked like. More the expression of someone who had sat with a hard truth overnight and come out the other side of it changed. "One more thing," Dumbledore said. He reached into his robe. He produced a very small object, wrapped in cloth, and held it out. "This belongs to you. It always has." Harry unwrapped it. It was a photograph. Small, slightly worn at the corners. Two people, young, laughing, the woman with dark red hair and green eyes and a laugh that Harry knew from 3 Nights of Dreaming, the man dark-haired and bright-eyed and wearing the particular expression of someone who has just made an exceptionally good joke and knows it. They were standing in front of a stone cottage and the woman had her head on the man's shoulder and they were both looking at the camera with the uncomplicated happiness of people who have no idea what is coming. "This was taken outside the cottage in Godric's Hollow," Dumbledore said. "The summer before." He paused. "I've kept a small collection of photographs from your parents' years at Hogwarts. I should have given them to you years ago." His voice was very quiet. "I'll bring them all to you this afternoon." Harry looked at the photograph for a long time. His mother was wearing the same blue dress from the garden memory. Not the same occasion, the garden in the memory had been a different house, earlier, before Godric's Hollow. But the same dress, which meant she'd loved it, which meant it was hers in the way that specific things become yours. He folded the photograph and put it carefully in his breast pocket. "Thank you," he said. He meant it. The DMLE investigators were not what he expected. He'd been building a picture of ministry investigators from the scraps of impressions he had, formal, bureaucratic, probably resistant to a 12-year-old's account of anything. What arrived at 9 o'clock were 2 people who moved through McGonagall's office with the alert practical efficiency of people who had done this hundreds of times and had developed opinions about it. Senior Investigator Thornton was a compact woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair pulled back and the particular kind of attention that processed everything without appearing to focus on anything specifically. Her partner, Investigator Aldous, was younger, quieter, the sort of person whose notepad was already out before he'd properly sat down. They'd asked for Harry first, alone. He'd said no. He'd said it calmly and with the specificity Hermione had coached him on. As the victim of a sustained criminal assault, he was entitled to have a support person present, and he was choosing his friends. There had been a brief pause from Thornton, and then she'd nodded once, and that was that. Hermione and Ron sat on the bench along the wall. Harry sat across the table from the investigators. McGonagall stood near the window. Dumbledore sat slightly apart, which Harry thought was deliberate, present but not centered, supporting without dominating. Thornton looked at Harry. "Mr. Potter," she said. "I want to start by being clear about something. We are here to investigate a crime that was committed against you. That means you are not a witness in an administrative inquiry, you are a victim whose account has legal standing. Nothing you tell us will be treated with anything less than full seriousness, regardless of," she paused with the particular precision of someone choosing words carefully, "regardless of the identities of any parties the evidence implicates." Harry looked at her. "Regardless of Bartemius Crouch Sr.?" Thornton and Aldous exchanged a look that was brief and professionally neutral. "You have information about the identity of the caster?" Aldous said. Harry put the envelope from Dumbledore on the table. He put Hermione's research folder beside it. He put his notebook, open to the documented fragments and his own chronological notes, beside that. Yes, he said. I have quite a bit. The meeting lasted 3 hours. It wasn't 3 hours of continuous formality, it was more like 3 hours of motion, of things building toward other things, of each piece of documentation leading to a question which led to an answer which required corroboration which Hermione would locate in her folder with the focused speed of someone who had organized specifically for this moment. Thornton was methodical and good. She asked questions that were precise and open-ended, not leading, not simplifying, but genuinely designed to extract accurate information rather than confirm a narrative she'd already written. Harry answered everything directly, and when he didn't know something he said so, and when he was reasoning from evidence rather than certain fact he said that too, and he noticed Thornton noting the distinctions, which meant she was noting his reliability as a source, which mattered. Dumbledore gave his testimony. He gave it fully, the protective cast, the cast at 7, the context of the prophecy, the parties he'd trusted and been misled by, his own culpability in the single casting he'd authorized. He gave it with the formal weight of a man who understood the legal significance of testimony and was not trying to manage it. Thornton asked him 3 follow-up questions. He answered all 3 without hesitation. Aldous wrote without stopping. When Thornton unrolled the signature analysis and Snape's attestation and placed them side by side, she looked at them for approximately 40 seconds. Then she looked at Aldous. Something passed between them that was purely professional, the look of 2 people who have worked together long enough to communicate complete sentences with their faces. The attestation is unambiguous, Aldous said quietly. I see that, Thornton said. She rolled the documents back carefully and put them in her own case. Mr. Potter, she said. I want to ask you directly about the 42nd casting. The most recent. I want your understanding of what you believe was taken by that specific charm. Harry thought about it. He'd been thinking about it all morning in the way that thinking about something all morning makes the eventual answer cleaner. I don't have full recovery of that memory yet, he said. The dissolution process is ongoing. But based on the timing, shortly before my 10th birthday, and based on what Healer Voss described as the target of the charm, he paused. I was starting to show signs. My suppressed development was beginning to break through. I think what the 42nd took was my awareness of that. My beginning sense of my own power. My ability to notice that something in me was waking up. He looked at Thornton. I think Crouch looked at a 10-year-old boy who was starting to become what he was supposed to be and decided that couldn't be allowed to happen, and he came and he erased the awareness of it. The way you take a candle away from someone in a dark room so they couldn't see how close the door was. The room was very quiet. Hermione made a very small sound. He didn't look at her. Why? Thornton asked. What is your understanding of his motive? Control, Harry said. And fear. He's spent his career being the person who decides what the magical world looks like. A child growing into the kind of power that prophecies describe is a variable he can't control. So he did what he does, he classified it as a security concern and used his authority to manage it. He paused. He probably told himself it was responsible. He probably believed he was making a hard decision that protected something important. And what do you think he was actually protecting? Thornton asked. Himself, Harry said simply. His version of how things should be. Thornton looked at him for a moment. For a 12-year-old, can everyone, Harry said, please stop noting that I'm 12 when I say something accurate? I've been 12 this entire time. The things I'm saying are accurate regardless. A pause. Then Thornton said, fair enough, and moved to her next question. Ron made a sound behind him that Harry was relatively confident was suppressed laughter. The formal portion ended at noon. Thornton and Aldous went with Dumbledore to the headmaster's office to review the additional documentation there, leaving Harry, Ron, and Hermione in McGonagall's office as she brought tea from somewhere with the brisk care of someone who needed to do something physical and useful. They sat with the tea and the post-meeting quiet. They believed everything, Hermione said. Not with surprise, exactly, but with the specific relief of someone who had prepared for the possibility of not being believed and was reassessing reality now that it hadn't happened. "Thornton's good," Harry said. "She was building a case the whole time. Every question was a brick." "Crouch flagged the case file," Ron said. "She knows that. She'll have seen it when she got the assignment and she'll know exactly what it means." He drank his tea. "She looked pretty calm for someone who knows she's about to arrest a senior ministry official." "That's probably why she's a senior investigator," Hermione said. McGonagall set down her own cup. "They won't arrest him today," she said. "The formal procedure requires the evidence to be reviewed by a panel of 3 senior legal officials. The signature analysis needs to be independently verified by the ministry's own forensic team, which cannot be anyone Crouch has authority over, and Thornton will make sure of that." She paused. "But it will happen. The documentation is substantial, the attestation is from reliable sources, and Crouch's interference with the case file is itself evidence of consciousness of guilt." She looked at Harry. "He made a mistake when he flagged that report. It was the kind of mistake frightened people make. He was so focused on the threat that he created a trail that leads directly to him." Harry looked at the window. "How long?" he asked. "To completion?" "Weeks, potentially. The legal process, to his removal from his position." McGonagall thought about this. "Days," she said. "Once Thornton's panel convenes, they can suspend his authority pending investigation. That happens quickly when the evidence is this clear." She paused. "He will fight it. He has connections, he has decades of influence, and he will not believe, may genuinely not believe, that he did anything wrong. That will be the difficult part." "People never believe the wrong thing when they were convinced they were right," Ron said, and said it in a way that sounded like he was quoting someone. "Your father?" Hermione asked. "Mum, actually," Ron said. "Usually about Fred and George." McGonagall looked like she was suppressing something that wasn't quite a smile. "In any case," she said, "what happens today, what happened in this room this morning, is not the end of the process. But it is the beginning of accountability. And that," she said precisely, "is different from nothing." After lunch, Real lunch, in the Great Hall, which Harry hadn't been in for 4 days and which produced the specific cognitive shock of hundreds of students and moving food and noise after a week of hospital wing quiet, Harry sent an owl to Mr. Weasley. He didn't tell him what had happened, because Thornton had asked for discretion until the panel convened. He just wrote, "It went well. Your advice helped. Thank you." He got a reply by evening that said, "I'm glad, Harry. Whatever happened today, I hope you know that the right people are in your corner. Come for Christmas if you can. Molly has already decided on the menu. Love, Arthur." He folded the note and put it in his robe pocket, next to his mother's photograph. The fragment came at midnight. He'd been expecting something. Healer Voss had said the process continued, that the dissolution of the outer layers was accelerating, that the older memories would start surfacing more consistently as the upper architecture dissolved. He'd been waiting for it the way you wait for something you know is coming and still can't quite prepare for. But this wasn't a gentle fragment. He was asleep and then he was 11 years old in the Hogwarts Express, in a compartment with Ron for the first time, and it felt real, fully real, not like a memory but like reliving, present tense, the smell of chocolate frog wrappers and the sound of wheels on the track and Ron's voice saying something about scabbers being useless, but underneath that, threaded through the actual memory, there was something else. A layer beneath the layer. A quality to the moment that hadn't been there when he'd lived it originally, or that had been there but that he hadn't had access to. Like hearing a piece of music for the first time and then hearing it again after someone has told you there's a second melody hidden in it, and this time you can hear it, and you wonder how you ever missed it. The second melody was power. Not dramatic power, not lightning bolt power, just the steady low hum of something enormous running very quietly beneath everything, like a river under a city that you can't hear but that's moving everything above it by infinitesimal degrees. It had been there the whole time. On the train. In the boat across the lake. In the great hall when the sorting hat had pressed down over his eyes. It had been there every single day at Hogwarts, and he'd been living on top of it, and the surface had looked like a normal talented student and underneath had been this. He came out of it sitting upright, fully awake, blinking at the dark dormitory. Neville made a sleep sound. Seamus turned over. Ron's curtains were drawn. Harry sat with the after-image of it and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for as long as he could remember. Not excitement, not triumph, something quieter and more fundamental. Like a word you've been trying to remember for years finally surfacing, and when it does, you can't believe you forgot it, and also you understand exactly why you forgot it. He reached under his bed for the notebook. He wrote, "The power wasn't gone. It was always there. They just buried the door." He looked at the sentence for a moment. Then he put the notebook away, lay back, and stared at the ceiling for a while. He thought about the Quidditch pitch. About the moment of freefall, the sky and the ground exchanging places and his hands leaving the broomstick. He thought about that enormous opening door sensation in his head that had sent him 60 feet downward. Something had been forcing its way through. The newest charm layer had been failing and what was underneath it had been pushing up, and his nervous system had not been able to manage the surge, and so he'd fallen. He was not going to fall again. The next 2 weeks were busy in the way that investigations become busy once they have sufficient evidence to move, not with drama but with paperwork, testimony, official letters arriving at Pomfrey's office and Dumbledore's office and McGonagall's office in a steady administrative tide that was somehow both more and less satisfying than Harry had imagined. Thornton's panel convened 6 days after the initial meeting. Crouch was suspended from his ministry position the following morning. Harry found out through Ron, who found out through his father, who sent a short owl that said, "Panel voted 3-0. Crouch suspended pending full investigation. He's fighting it but the evidence is airtight. Tell Harry this one is going to stick." He'd been in Transfiguration when he read it. He'd read it under the desk during a particularly involved exercise involving teapots and tortoises, and he'd folded the note and put it in his pocket and looked at his teapot and thought about nothing for about 4 seconds. Then he'd pointed his wand at the teapot and said the incantation McGonagall had given them last week, the one he'd been finding reasonably straightforward but no more than that. The teapot became a tortoise in 0.4 seconds. Fully formed. Already walking. Extremely confident looking. McGonagall went so still at the front of the class that 3 students turned to look at her. "Potter," she said. "Professor." She walked down to his desk and looked at the tortoise and then at him over her glasses. "That incantation," she said, "is rated for 4th-year mastery." "It came easier today," Harry said. McGonagall looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was very precisely controlled and doing several things simultaneously. Then she straightened up and said, in a completely professional tone that nonetheless had something bright and fierce and proud moving behind it, 10 points to Gryffindor, and walked back to the front of the class. From across the room, Hermione was looking at him with an expression of absolute delight. Ron mouthed bloody hell. Harry looked at the tortoise, which was investigating the edge of the desk with the thoroughness of an animal that had just come into existence 30 seconds ago and was extremely interested in its circumstances. "Yeah," Harry said, quietly, to no one in particular. "It did, didn't it?" Healer Voss came for a 4th session on the 15th day. By then Harry had been building a practice, something that had started instinctively in the days after the Transfiguration incident and formalized itself into a daily routine. He'd been spending an hour each evening in an unused classroom on the 2nd floor, alone, doing nothing more complicated than attempting spells he already knew. Just attempting them. Seeing what was different. What was different, increasingly, was everything. Not in a way he could have easily described to someone who hadn't watched it happen. It wasn't that spells became automatic or effortless, it was that the gap between intention and result narrowed. The thing he'd always felt in flying, the directness of it, the minimal distance between wanting and having, was slowly, day by day, extending itself to his wand work. As though the ceiling Pomfrey had described was rising daily and taking the constraint with it, and below the ceiling the air was different, and in the different air he was simply more himself. He didn't tell many people about the practice sessions. He told Ron and Hermione, obviously, and he'd mentioned them to Pomfrey. He didn't broadcast it, partly because he didn't want to perform it and partly because he was still getting used to it himself, still adjusting to the difference between the Harry he'd been before the tryouts and the Harry he was becoming. Voss ran her diagnostics and read the scrolls in her focused silence. "Progress," she said. "I noticed," Harry said. "The most recent 7 layers are fully dissolved," she said. "The next tier down they're integrating. Not dissolving as fast, because these are older and more integrated, but the process is ongoing." She looked at him. "The suppression effect healer assessment noted 2 weeks ago, the ceiling Madame Pomfrey described, I want to give you the updated number. Your resonance at initial assessment was at 43% of projected baseline for your bloodline and age." She paused. "Today it's at 71%. Harry blinked. "And normal is, what, 100%? Projected baseline is the theoretical maximum extrapolated from your bloodline signatures. 100% would be extraordinary for anyone, most witches and wizards operate at 80 to 90% of their projected maximum." She looked at her scroll and then at him. "At your current rate of increase, you'll reach baseline in approximately 6 to 8 weeks. After which," she stopped. "After which we're in genuinely new territory. The suppression has been in place for so long that we don't know precisely what removal of all 42 layers will look like in practice." "You're saying you don't know what I'll be able to do," Harry said. "I'm saying the projection models assumed the suppression was the only limiting factor," Voss said. "If that's correct, then baseline for you is considerable." She said the word with professional care. "If there are natural limitations beyond the suppression, then considerably less so. We won't know until we're there." Harry thought about the river under the city. The hum beneath everything. "I'm not worried about it," he said. Voss looked at him. "No," she said, after a moment. "I don't imagine you are." He was in the unused classroom on the evening of the 18th day, going through a set of charms exercises, when the door opened and Snape came in. Harry stopped mid-incantation and looked at him. Snape looked at what Harry had been doing. For separate objects he'd been moving simultaneously, which was a 7th-year level application of levitation charms, and which had come to him that afternoon with the ease of breathing, and his expression did something brief and complicated that was not quite what Harry had expected from Snape. It wasn't the familiar cold disdain. It was something that sat closer to complicated satisfaction, the expression of someone who is watching something they expected happen and is finding the experience more affecting than they'd anticipated. "I heard about Crouch's suspension," Harry said. "Yes." Snape came further into the room and the door swung shut behind him. He stood with his hands folded behind his back, looking at the suspended objects. "He will attempt to challenge the panel's finding. He has the legal right to do so, and the challenge will take 3 to 4 months to process, and it will fail." He looked at Harry. "The signature analysis is forensically conclusive. Even his own legal representation will know that. Will he go to Azkaban? Possibly. Probably not. His solicitors will argue mitigating circumstances, and there are genuine ones. He will lose his ministry position, his authority, and his reputation." Snape said it flatly. "In his particular case, I believe that is the more significant consequence." Harry thought about Crouch. The kind of man who sent his own son to Azkaban because the rules mattered more than blood. The kind of man who had built his entire identity on being right, on being the one who made the hard necessary calls. A man like that, stripped of his position, forced to sit with the fact that the hard necessary call he'd made on a 10-year-old child had been criminal, that was its own particular justice. "Good," Harry said simply. Snape was quiet for a moment. "The objects," he said, gesturing at the 4 still floating items. "How long has this been available to you?" "This specific, maybe 5 days. Harry lowered them gently to the floor. Things are coming easier every few days. Different things. Show me something else, Snape said. It was such an un-Snape thing to say, not a demand, not a challenge, more like a straightforward request from someone who needed to see something for their own understanding, that Harry complied without thinking about it. He turned to the blank classroom wall and considered it and then cast, without announcing what he was doing, a lumos so controlled and directed that it functioned less like a light-emitting charm and more like a beam, sharp and focused and going exactly where he pointed it. Not dramatically powerful. Just exactly what he intended. Snape looked at it for a moment. You're controlling the output parameters, he said. Not just casting. Yeah. That's not second-year wand work. I know. Snape was quiet. He looked at Harry with an expression that Harry was still learning to read. It had more in it than the classroom version, more layers, and the layers were complicated in ways that had to do with things Harry only partly understood. Lily Evans, probably. James Potter, certainly. The prophecy. The choices Snape had made and the choices that had been made for him and the particular ongoing cost of having been on the wrong side first. I owe you an honest account of something, Snape said. Harry waited. When I brought the partial prophecy to Voldemort, Snape said, I did not know the child described was the son of a woman. I did not know it was you. But I knew it was a child. I knew that whatever I was facilitating would be turned on someone's child, and I told myself that the needs of the cause outweighed. He stopped. The needs of the cause did not outweigh it. There is no calculation in which they do. I have known that for 11 years. He said it precisely and without self-exculpation. The Death Eater castings on you, 11 of which I could identify, 11 of those were made possible in part because of what I gave Voldemort. I cannot undo that. But I want you to know I have understood it, since before you were born, and that understanding has shaped everything I've done since. Harry looked at him for a long moment. You've been protecting me, Harry said. Since Hogwarts. Attempting to. Because of my mum. Snape said nothing for a moment. Partly, he said. And partly because the debt is real, and I pay real debts. He looked at the wall. And partly because you are not what I expected you to be. What I expected was your father. He stopped. You are considerably more yourself than I gave you credit for. Coming from Snape, Harry thought, that was approximately equivalent to another person saying you're the most extraordinary person I've ever met. I found out you can identify 11 of the Death Eater signatures, Harry said. Does that mean you're going to testify in the legal proceedings? I already have, Snape said. In writing. Full testimony on all 11 attribution identifications, provided to Thornton's panel 3 days ago. He looked at Harry with an expression that was challenging him to say something about it. It was the appropriate action. Harry nodded. Yes, he said. It was. Snape looked at him for another moment. Then he said, put the objects back up. Harry looked at him. If you're going to use this room for practice, Snape said, in the tone of a teacher who has made a decision and is presenting it as established fact, you may as well do it properly. You have a significant amount of capability to calibrate, and calibration without instruction produces bad habits. He pulled out a chair and sat at the room's single desk as though he owned it, which was very much a Snape way to sit. Start with the 4-object levitation again. This time tell me what you're feeling, not what you're doing. Harry looked at him. He thought about this man, who had been a Death Eater and was a spy and had been cold and unfair to him since September in the way that Harry now understood was a performance of impartiality covering something considerably more complicated. Who had given Voldemort the prophecy and then spent 11 years paying for it. Who had walked into his hospital ward and told him to ask Dumbledore the right questions. Who had sent a note to Thornton's panel that said I will testify to that and had done it. Okay, Harry said. He raised the 4 objects. He told Snape what it felt like. 3 weeks after the fall, on a Tuesday morning with frost on the Quidditch pitch and the sky a clean hard blue, Harry went back to flying. He went alone, before breakfast, without telling anyone. He borrowed a school broom from the equipment shed, not his Nimbus, which he'd use properly later, and just stood on the pitch for a moment, holding it, feeling the cold air and the smell of frost-hardened grass and the early light coming gold over the castle's east towers. He thought about the last time he'd been here. The spreading sensation. The tilting horizon. The 60-foot fall. He got on the broom. He pushed off. He went up, slowly at first, feeling the familiar rightness of it settle around him like a coat he'd missed, and there it was, exactly as it had always been, the thing that had always been undiminished, the instinctive kinetic magic that the Obliviations couldn't touch. Exactly as it always was. Except that what was around it was different. The hum under everything was audible now, not literally, but perceptibly, and on the broom with the cold air against his face and the castle spread below him he could feel the full reach of it, the actual dimensions of what had been running quietly under his floors his whole life, and it was, large. It was genuinely large. And he was going to need time to learn the edges of it, to understand what it meant in practice, to figure out who he was inside it. He kicked into a dive. He pulled up 10 feet above the grass, heart going, laughing. He climbed back up and leveled out at 100 feet and looked at the castle. He thought about a woman in a blue dress sitting on a garden step with her feet on the warm stone and a cup of tea and her arm around a small boy. He thought about a man on a sitting room floor with a spinning cork in absolute unguarded joy. He thought about 42 holes in a shape that had always been meant to be whole, and how filling them back in was going to take time, and how that was all right, because for the first time he understood what the whole shape actually looked like. He looked at the castle. He thought about what came next, the final hearing, Crouch's challenge, the ongoing dissolution process, the meetings with Voss, the practice sessions with Snape, the conversations with Dumbledore that were different now, slower and more honest, building something that was not what it had been before but was maybe better. He thought about Hermione with her notebooks and her cross-references and the absolute fierce precision of her care. He thought about Ron handing him a spare quill in the dark. He thought about what he'd written in the notebook 15 days ago. I'm going to be everything they tried to stop me from being. He sat on the broom 100 feet above the frost-covered Quidditch pitch and breathed cold October air and felt the whole enormous quiet hum of himself, finally, for the first time. Yeah, he thought. He dove again. Pulled up again. Climbed again. Below him, the castle was waking up. Chapter 6, The Boy Who Remembered the Hearing was on a Wednesday in November, 6 weeks after the fall. Harry knew about it 4 days in advance because Thornton sent an official notification to Pomfrey, who passed it to McGonagall, who brought it to Harry during a free period on a Saturday afternoon in the way she brought serious things, without preamble, without softening, just the document and a level look and the implicit understanding that he could take the time he needed with it. He read it at the table in McGonagall's office with a cup of tea going cold beside him. The hearing was formal. Ministry Wisengamot Chamber, full panel, Crouch appearing to challenge the suspension findings. Thornton's team presenting the full evidentiary case. Harry would be asked to give testimony, which was voluntary. Thornton had noted that clearly, twice, in separate sections of the notification, but which, the notification also noted, would constitute the most direct account of sustained harm and would likely be the most significant testimony heard. He put the document down. I'll testify, he said. McGonagall nodded once. I'll inform Thornton. I want Ron and Hermione in the chamber. I'll request gallery access. She paused. I'll also be there. And Professor Dumbledore. Another pause. And Mr. Weasley, Arthur, has already written requesting to attend. He said to tell you he was planning to be there regardless of whether you needed him, but that he thought you should know. Harry looked at the notification on the table. He thought about the Wisengamot chamber. He'd read about it in A History of Magic, the tiered stone seats, the dock in the center, the formal weight of the whole enormous room. He thought about standing in the center of it and talking about his mother's voice and 42 holes and a man who had decided that a 10-year-old's developing power was a threat that needed managing. He thought about being 12 and being in that room and the people who would be watching him think that. Good, he said. I want all of them there. The 4 days between Saturday and Wednesday were useful ones. He spent them the way he'd learned to spend difficult approaching things, not waiting for them, not rehearsing them, but filling the time with work that mattered and letting the waiting be background noise rather than foreground. He had Snape's practice sessions on Monday and Tuesday evenings, which by now had developed a specific rhythm that was unlike anything Harry had in any other class. Snape didn't teach the way he taught potions, with the cold authority of someone distributing information from a height. He taught the way Harry imagined good soldiers taught other soldiers, with the directness of someone who needed the person across from them to be capable because something real depended on it. Monday's session went for 2 hours. They worked on precision, deliberate control of output, directing spells with the specificity of surgical instruments rather than the blunt deployment Harry had been defaulting to. Snape was exacting and corrected without padding the correction, and the corrections were always accurate, and Harry had learned to receive them as information rather than criticism, which was something he suspected Snape had been working toward from the beginning. You're anticipating the spell, Snape said, halfway through, watching Harry cast a modified Lumos at a series of small targets on the classroom wall. I'm not, Harry said. You are. Watch your wand hand. You're already moving before the incantation completes. Harry watched his wand hand on the next cast. He was anticipating the spell. He said. The habit comes from underconfidence, Snape said, without making it a judgment. When you've had limited trust in the spell's reliability, you compensate by beginning the physical execution early. Now that the reliability is, he paused. Now that the ceiling has risen, the habit is maladaptive. Let the incantation finish before the motion begins. Harry tried it. The Lumos hit the second target with a precision he'd been 5 degrees off previously. Clean, direct, fully intentional. Better, Snape said, and moved on. They were packing up at the end of Tuesday's session, Harry straightening the moved furniture, Snape collecting his notes with the efficiency of someone who had been a spy long enough that he left no traces of himself in any room he occupied, when Snape said, without looking up from his parchments, the Wizengamot chamber has particular magical acoustics. Spells cast within the chamber are amplified in their ambient signature. When you take the testimony stand, everyone in the room will be able to feel the general character of your magical field. Harry frowned. Feel it how? Not specifically. Not intelligibly. An impression of magnitude and quality. He straightened the parchments. This is not a problem. I mention it because you should be aware of it rather than surprised by it. He looked at Harry. At your current resonance level, the impression will be noticeable. Harry looked at him for a moment. You're telling me it'll help. I'm telling you to be aware of your environment, Snape said precisely. What you do with that awareness is your own business. He put the parchments under his arm and went to the door, and then paused without turning. You have your mother's capacity for controlled precision, he said. And your father's instinctive timing. The combination is, not common. He opened the door. Wednesday. Don't be late. He left. Harry stood in the empty room for a moment. Then he turned off the lights and went to bed. Wednesday came cold and clear, the kind of November morning that was all hard edges and clean air, frost on every horizontal surface and the castle's towers very sharp against a sky that was too blue to be real. Harry was dressed by 7, ate a proper breakfast because Hermione had appeared at the Gryffindor table and watched him eat with the focused attention of a person running a welfare check, and was in the entrance hall by 8:30 where the small group assembled. McGonagall in her best robes. Dumbledore in midnight blue. Hermione with her satchel and the organized documentation and the very specific expression she wore when she was about to walk into a situation she had prepared thoroughly for and was still nervous about. Ron in his dress robes, which were slightly too short in the arms after a summer growth spurt, wearing them with the particular Weasley quality of not caring about the two short arms because there were more important things. Arthur Weasley was waiting outside the front doors, which Harry hadn't fully expected despite being told, and finding him there, in his slightly worn ministry robes with his warm open face and the lines around his eyes that came from a lifetime of genuine smiling, produced a feeling in Harry's chest that was uncomplicated and warm in a way that few things were that morning. "Harry," Arthur said, and shook his hand with both of his, the way he always did. "Ready?" "Yes," Harry said. He meant it. They fled from McGonagall's office. Dumbledore had arranged temporary access to the Ministry Floo network, and came through into the Ministry atrium in a series of green flares, and Harry stood in the familiar high-ceilinged golden space and let the Ministry wash over him. The fountain in the center. The queues at the security desk. The robed figures moving with the purposeful efficiency of a large institution doing its daily work. He'd been here before. A year ago. Collecting his school supplies, standing next to Hagrid, looking at everything with the open amazed eyes of someone encountering their world for the first time. He was back now with 42 pieces of himself that hadn't been his then. They went through security. They took the lifts. Level 10, Department of Magical Law Enforcement and, beneath it, the courtrooms. The Wizengamot chamber was older than Harry had imagined. He'd pictured something institutional, formal but modern in the way of official spaces. What he got instead was stone, deep, old, porous stone that had absorbed centuries of deliberation and tension and consequence, that held the quality of the things that had happened in it the way cloth holds the smell of smoke long after the fire is out. The tiered seats rose in a horseshoe around the central floor, and the floor itself was lit from above by long narrow windows near the ceiling that sent bars of cold November light down at steep angles. The gallery was already half full when they arrived. Harry registered faces, some ministry, some press, some he didn't recognize. In the upper tier, 4 people who had the formal attentiveness of people who came to these proceedings regularly. The full Wizengamot panel, seated. Crouch was already in the room. He was sitting in the respondents section with 2 solicitors on either side of him, wearing formal robes and an expression that Harry catalogued quickly and carefully, composed, certain, the expression of a man who believed he was going to win this and had constructed that belief on solid ground. He was older than Harry had expected. The photographs he'd seen in the historical records were from a decade ago, and Crouch had aged considerably in the intervening time. He was still commanding. Still the kind of person who occupied space with authority. He looked at Harry across the chamber floor. Harry looked back. Crouch's expression didn't change. But something behind it did, a brief, involuntary recalibration that he recovered immediately. Whatever he'd expected Harry Potter to look like walking into this chamber, it hadn't been this. Harry found his seat in the witness section, between Dumbledore and the empty chair that Thornton gestured at with a brief nod. He sat. He put his hands flat on his knees. He looked at the chamber and let himself feel the size of it. Snape was right about the acoustics. He could feel the ambient magic of the room, not clearly, more like the way you feel the temperature change when you move from one room to another. The room was saturated with the residue of old deliberations, old magic, old decisions. And within it, he could feel the edges of his own magical field in a way he usually couldn't, could feel the room's resonance engaging with his, the way 2 notes together produce a third harmonic that neither contains individually. He breathed. He waited. The proceedings opened with formal declarations that Harry mostly let wash over him, the legal framework, the charges as formally stated, the rights of the respondent. The panel's senior justice, a woman with silver hair and the impartial gravity of a person who had been listening to difficult truths for decades, ran the room with the precision of someone who didn't need to raise her voice because the room simply organized itself around her authority. Thornton presented first. She was exactly as Harry expected from having worked with her, methodical, precise, devastating in the quiet way of someone who lets evidence do the work that drama would do less reliably. She walked the panel through the documentary evidence in a logical sequence that built from the earliest established facts toward the present with the steady inevitability of a well-constructed argument. She introduced the signature analysis. She introduced Snape's attestation. She introduced Healer Voss's clinical findings. She introduced Hermione's archived documentation of the ministry records with a footnote that attributed the discovery to a research assistant working in support of the primary investigation, and didn't name her, which Harry thought Hermione would find both appropriate and slightly frustrating. She introduced Arthur Weasley's unofficial corroboration of Crouch's erratic behavior in the period immediately following the DMLE case file flagging. She introduced the case file flag itself, which she presented last and briefly, and let the panel sit with the obvious implication. Crouch's solicitors objected to the signature analysis on grounds of methodological reliability, standard legal challenge to forensic magical evidence. Thornton had anticipated this, and her response was 12 pages of documented methodology and independent verification that she placed on the panel table with the quiet confidence of someone removing a very large trump card from a very organized hand. Then it was Crouch's turn. His lead solicitor was accomplished. Harry watched him work and found himself grudgingly attentive, because the argument being constructed was not the argument Harry had expected. He'd expected denial. What he got was reframing. The evidence of casting is not disputed, the solicitor said. My client does not dispute that a memory modification was performed on the subject in the period indicated. What is disputed is the characterization of that action as a criminal assault. He turned the reframing with the practiced ease of a professional. Under Section 7 of the Magical Emergency Classification Act of 1974, the authorized head of the Office of Magical Emergency Classification held specific powers to employ protective magical intervention in circumstances constituting a national security emergency. What was done in this instance was done under that authority, in the context of an active Death Eater program targeting a child whose magical development represented a potential national security variable. He let that sit. My client made a difficult decision, the solicitor continued, in circumstances of extraordinary pressure, using powers he held legitimately, with the intention of protecting both the subject and the broader stability of the post-war wizarding world. The question before this panel is not whether he acted, but whether the action was within the scope of his authority. Silence. Harry looked at Crouch. Crouch was watching the panel with the expression of a man who believed this argument would work, who had constructed it carefully and believed in it, and who, Harry thought, had perhaps even believed in it at the time. The convenient thing about genuinely believing you were right was that it made every action feel like protection rather than control. The panel's senior justice said, Investigator Thornton. Do you wish to respond to the Section 7 argument? Yes. Thornton stood. Section 7 of the Magical Emergency Classification Act grants the authorized head of the OEM specific powers in circumstances of national emergency. These powers do not include memory modification of minors. Section 7 is explicit that memory modification falls under Section 14b of the Improper Use of Magic Act regardless of the authorizing framework, and Section 14b does not contain a national security exception. She paused. Additionally, even if Section 7 were applicable, its jurisdiction expired with the disbanding of the OEM in 1987. The 42nd casting, performed 14 months ago, was performed under no current legal authority whatsoever. The respondent has not held an OEM position for 8 years. She sat down. The argument applies, at best, to some of the early castings. It does not apply to the most recent one. The room was very quiet. Crouch's solicitors conferred in whispers. Senior Justice Fairweather said, "We will hear from the primary witness at this time." Harry stood. He was 12 years old and wearing his school robes because McGonagall had said his school robes were appropriate and also because he'd decided that being visibly 12 in that chamber was not a disadvantage. The tiered seats held people who had spent their careers making decisions about what constituted acceptable treatment of people younger and smaller than themselves. He wanted to be visible as exactly what he was. He walked to the testimony stand. He put his hands on the rail and looked at the panel and then let his gaze move to Crouch. Crouch looked back. His expression had changed, the composed certainty was still there but there was something underneath it now, something that had been growing since Harry had walked into the chamber, that looked almost like what it was, a man confronting the full human consequence of a decision that had been entirely abstract to him when he made it. Senior Justice Fairweather said, "Mr. Potter. You are here voluntarily to give testimony regarding the sustained magical modification of your memories over the course of your life. You are not required to answer any question that you feel is, 'I'd like to just say what I need to say,'" Harry said. "And then answer questions after." A brief pause. "Very well." He looked at the panel. "I don't want to give you a legal argument," he said. "Investigator Thornton has done that and she's done it correctly. What I want to tell you is what it was like." He paused. "I want to tell you about waking up every day for 11 years in a cupboard under the stairs in a house where nobody wanted me, and not knowing why I felt like something was missing. Not knowing why the people around me felt so wrong, why everything felt like a performance of a life rather than an actual one. I want to tell you that I assumed that was normal. That I assumed everyone felt like they were living in a slightly wrong version of themselves and that the right version was somewhere they couldn't reach." He looked at the gallery, briefly, found Ron's face and Hermione's and then looked back at the panel. "I had 42 pieces of myself taken before I had the language to describe what was being taken. I had memories of my parents, my actual parents, alive, warm, real, erased while I was young enough that I grew up believing I simply didn't have them. That I was too young when they died to have retained anything. I thought the absence was mine." He stopped for a moment. "It wasn't mine. It was done to me. By Death Eaters who were afraid of what I might become. And by a ministry official who decided that his certainty about the right shape of the world outweighed my right to exist in it fully." He looked at Crouch. "I'm not going to tell you I hate you," he said, directly to him. "I'm going to tell you what you cost me, because that's more honest than hate. You took my awareness of my own mind. You took the beginning of understanding who I was. You came to my home, to where I lived with people who already didn't want me, and you sat across from a 10-year-old boy and used your authority and your wand to make sure I stayed smaller than I was supposed to be." He paused. "And you told yourself it was necessary. And maybe in the moment you believed it." He didn't look away from Crouch's face. "The thing about that is, believing you're right doesn't change what you did. It just means you did the wrong thing with full confidence, which is in some ways worse." He turned back to the panel. "I'm 12 years old and I am standing here recovering from something that was done to me before I could speak, and I'm asking you to hold the person who did it accountable. Not because I think it will undo anything. It won't. The process of getting myself back is mine to do and I'm doing it." He let a beat pass. "I'm asking you to hold him accountable because the next child this happens to, whoever they are, whatever prophecy or inconvenience they represent, they deserve to know that this is a crime and not a policy decision. That their mind is not a variable in someone else's calculation." He stopped. "That's everything." He stepped back from the rail. The chamber was very quiet. And then he felt it, what Snape had described, the room's acoustics, the ambient resonance of the space engaging with his. He hadn't done anything intentional, hadn't performed anything. But the chamber was reacting the way Snape had said it would, with the simple honest fact of what was in the room, and he felt the gallery shift in their seats and the panel members look at him with the particular attention of people who are registering something they hadn't fully anticipated. He went back to his seat. Dumbledore put a hand briefly on his shoulder and removed it. Harry looked at his hands. Crouch's solicitors attempted 3 further arguments over the next hour. Thornton neutralized each of them with the patient efficiency of someone who had planned for exactly this and was simply executing the plan. The Section 7 argument had been the best they had, and it hadn't been enough. At 2 o'clock, the panel requested a 30-minute deliberation. At 2:37, they returned. Senior Justice Fairweather read the finding in a level voice that did not editorialize or perform. "The facts were sufficient," her tone said, "and ornamentation would have been indecent." The suspension was upheld. The evidence of the 40-second casting was found sufficient to proceed to formal criminal charges. The earlier castings under the OEM authorization were referred to a separate review panel for historical legal analysis. Crouch's ministry credentials and access were to be revoked immediately pending the criminal proceedings. She read it and then she looked at Harry directly and said, "The panel notes, for the record, that the testimony given today demonstrated a clarity and precision of account that is rarely encountered in these proceedings, and that the investigation which produced the evidentiary record before us was comprehensive and conducted with full rigor." She wasn't talking about Thornton. Thornton knew it and didn't mind. Harry said, "Thank you." Then it was over. The atrium afterward had the quality of a held breath releasing. The group of them stood near the fountain and there was a moment that was too full to immediately put into words, Arthur with his hand on Ron's shoulder, Hermione pressing her fingers to her mouth with her eyes bright, McGonagall looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for something and is not yet fully ready to believe it has happened. Dumbledore stood slightly apart, and Harry went to him. "Well done," Dumbledore said quietly. "You were going to say something else," Harry said. He could tell, there was a quality to the way Dumbledore was holding himself. "I was going to say that your parents would be," he stopped. "I'll give you the photographs tonight," he said instead. "All of them." "There are more than I initially said. I've been collecting them for 11 years. Harry looked at him. "You've been saving them for me," he said. "Always." They looked at each other. "I'm still angry," Harry said. "Not as a threat. Just as information." "I know," Dumbledore said. "You should be." A pause. "For what it's worth, which may be very little or may be something, depending on the day, I am going to spend the rest of my time as your headmaster trying to be the thing I should have been from the beginning. Which is someone who tells you the truth and lets you be who you are." He looked at Harry with the full weight of whatever he was. "Not a piece I move. Not a variable I manage. You." Harry stood with this for a moment. He thought about the garden and the cottage step and the woman in the blue dress. He thought about his father on the floor with the spinning cork. He thought about 42 holes and what was slowly, carefully filling them back in, not replacement, not reconstruction, but recovery. The real thing, coming back to where it belonged. "Okay," he said finally. "That's a start." Dumbledore nodded. He stepped back, and the fountain played quietly between them in the golden atrium light, and Harry went back to the others. The journey back to Hogwarts was loud in the way that follows intense silence, everyone talking at once and then nobody talking and then talking again, jumping between subjects with the nervous energy of people coming down from something significant. Arthur walked with Harry for a while and didn't say much, which was its own kind of comfort. Ron told a completely irrelevant story about something Seamus had done with a levitation charm last week that somehow perfectly timed the decompression of the whole day. By the time they stepped through the Hogwarts front doors into the familiar smell of stone and old wood and the particular Hogwarts quality that Harry had come to understand was the ambient magic of the castle itself, the day had settled into something that felt less like an ending and more like a threshold crossed. He stopped in the entrance hall. Hermione and Ron stopped with him. "What?" Ron said. "Nothing." Harry looked at the staircase. The ceiling. The portraits. I've been in this castle for a year and 2 months, and I've always felt like I was, slightly missing something. Like there was a room I kept almost finding." He paused. "I think it might just be here now." Hermione looked at him. "Is it strange?" she asked. "Coming back. After all of it?" "No," he said. It actually feels more like coming home than it ever has." Ron considered this. "Good," he said, and headed for the stairs. "Because I have an astronomy essay due tomorrow that I haven't started, and I need you to explain what a perihelion is while I write it." "I know what a perihelion is," Harry said. "Obviously. That's why I need you to explain it. Come on." Harry followed him up the stairs, and Hermione followed both of them, still carrying her satchel, still in her best robes, already pulling out a textbook. That evening, Dumbledore brought the photographs. He brought them to the Gryffindor common room rather than his office, which Harry thought was significant, and McGonagall let him in with the combination of reluctance and necessity that was their current dynamic. She was not entirely comfortable with Dumbledore's access to Harry while things were still unsettled between them, but she understood the necessity, and Dumbledore understood her discomfort, and the result was a kind of respectful mutual navigation that had its own awkward dignity. He put a box on the table by the fire. A real box, wood, well made, obviously old. He stepped back. All of it, he said simply. Letters, photographs, a few small objects your parents asked me to keep when they went into hiding. He paused. They're yours. They've always been yours. Harry opened the box. The photographs were on top. There were 37 of them. He went through them slowly. His mother at 16 in these hallways, laughing at something off camera, her prefect badge catching the light. His father in Quidditch robes at the pitch, this pitch, Harry's pitch, mid-dive, pure joy on his face. The two of them at what looked like the Hogwarts Yule celebration in their 7th year, standing close, not yet together by the look of it but the distance between them full of intention. His mother graduating, cap slightly sideways, laughing, Dumbledore beside her looking 30 years younger and tremendously pleased. His father with 3 other young men Harry didn't recognize but felt, in a complicated way, some recognition toward, dark-haired, Sirius Black, small sandy-haired man who would be Peter Pettigrew, a tired kind-faced young man who might be Remus Lupin. He went through all 37 and then went back to the beginning and went through them again more slowly. Nobody talked while he did it. At the bottom of the box, under the photographs and beneath 3 letters in his mother's handwriting addressed to him that he put to one side to read alone later, was a small object wrapped in flannel. He unwrapped it. A wooden toy broomstick. 10 inches long. Intricately carved. The bristles were real, tiny, still flexible after 11 years. He looked at it. He looked up at Dumbledore. That was his, Dumbledore said, quietly. Your father made it. He charmed it to fly at precisely the right height for a very small child. He paused. Your mother wrote to me when you were 8 months old, she said you'd started reaching for it before you could stand, and that James was insufferably proud. His voice was almost entirely steady. I found it in the cottage afterward and I kept it. I should have given it to you when I placed you. I kept telling myself you were too young. And then time kept passing. Harry closed his fingers around the tiny broomstick. He could feel it, the charm his father had put on it, faded but present, like a warmth that had decided to stay long after the source had gone. He could feel the shape of the magic in it, his father's specific hand in it, personal as fingerprints. He was 12 years old, sitting by the fire in Gryffindor Tower with a box of 37 photographs and his father's toy broomstick and his mother's letters, and the room was very warm, and his 2 best friends were sitting on either side of him, and outside the windows November was doing its cold grey work on the grounds, and the castle was making all its familiar sounds. He closed his hand around the broomstick. He didn't cry. Not because it wasn't the kind of moment for it but because the feeling was too large for tears. It had gone past the size where tears would have been adequate. It sat in his chest like something finally solid. Like weight, but the right kind of weight. The kind that anchored rather than dragged. Thank you, he said to Dumbledore. Dumbledore nodded once. He stood. I'll leave you to it, he said. He walked to the portrait hole. At it, he turned. Harry. Harry looked at him. You are, everything your parents hoped for, Dumbledore said. Everything. And considerably more than I deserve to have helped produce. He stepped through the portrait hole. The fire crackled. Ron looked at the toy broomstick in Harry's hand and then at Harry's face and seemed to reach a conclusion about what was needed, which was nothing, and he leaned back in the chair and put his feet on the coffee table in the comfortable way of someone who was planning to be here for however long was necessary and didn't need anything said about it. Hermione put her hand on Harry's arm for a moment. Just that. Harry opened the first letter. His mother's handwriting was small and neat with occasional sudden loops on the long letters, the handwriting of someone who had learned good penmanship and then developed a personal language within it. The letter was dated July 1981, 3 months before Halloween night, and it was addressed in full, for Harry, when he's old enough. Dear Harry, I'm writing this because your father says I'm being morbid and I'm writing it anyway, because there are things I want you to know that might not reach you any other way. We're in hiding. You don't know that, you're 1 year old and you think the world is the size of this cottage and that seems right to me, that the world should be small and manageable when you're 1. I hope when you read this the world is much larger for you and much better. The first thing I want to tell you is about the morning you were born. Harry read the whole letter twice. Then he folded it with great care and put it back in its envelope and held it for a moment. He was going to read all 3 letters. Not tonight. Tonight he would start with this one and sit with it and let it be the only thing it needed to be. The others would wait. They'd waited 11 years. A few more days was nothing. He put the letter in his breast pocket, next to the photograph of his parents in front of the cottage, and closed the box. 3 weeks later, he was back in the Quidditch pitch. Full practice now, Oliver had been conducting drills with a kind of manic relief, as though Harry's return to the team had proved something he hadn't been able to relax about. The new chaser, Lyanna Marsh, was extraordinary in the specific way that made Oliver get slightly misty-eyed about the future. Harry flew the search patterns. He found the snitch 11 minutes in, which was fast even by his standards. It had been attempting to hide in the shadow of the east goalpost, which was a reasonable strategy that hadn't accounted for Harry's sight line changing since the suppression had started to lift. His peripheral vision was sharper. He didn't know how else to describe it, it was as though the world had a higher resolution than it used to. He held the snitch in his closed fist and felt it struggle and then still. He stayed at altitude for a moment, not descending yet, looking out over the castle. The lake was iron-gray today, the trees along the bank fully stripped, their black lines against the sky like cracks in something. The castle's towers were solid and ancient and exactly themselves. He thought about Crouch in his house somewhere waiting for criminal proceedings that would take the better part of a year and strip him of everything he'd built. He thought about 11 Death Eaters whose signatures Snape had identified, 4 of whom were not in Azkaban and were now subjects of active investigation. He thought about Lucius Malfoy, whose solicitors had already been in contact with the DMLE and who would spend a great deal of money attempting to argue that following Voldemort's standing orders constituted some kind of defense, and who was not going to find that argument as useful as he hoped. He thought about Dumbledore in his circular office doing the work of being accountable, which seemed to involve a great deal of reading and a great deal of correspondence and, from what Harry could tell, a genuine and ongoing effort to do the thing he'd said he'd do, to be different. Whether that continued was something Harry was watching. He was watching with the attention of someone who had learned the cost of not watching. He thought about the dissolution process, ongoing, layer by layer, the older memories surfacing in the notebook now with regular frequency. Last week he'd gotten a full clear memory of his father teaching him, at perhaps 6 months old, to grip a broomstick. Not to ride it, just to grip it. His hands around the handle, his father's hands around his, the specific warmth of it. He'd written 4 pages in the notebook about that one memory and could have written more. He thought about who he was now compared to who he'd been 8 weeks ago, and he thought that compared was maybe the wrong framework. It wasn't comparison, it was completion. Not a different person. The same person with more of themselves. He opened his hand. The snitch sat on his palm for exactly 1 second, its wings half extended, catching the November light. Then it burst away and vanished into the gray air. He watched it go. Below him, from the pitch, Oliver would shouted something that was probably about protocols. Fred and George Weasley were laughing about something. Lyanna Marsh was doing a passing drill with Angelina that was genuinely beautiful to watch. Harry looked out at the grey sky and the iron lake and the stripped trees and the castle that was older than almost everything and had housed more than its share of history and had, 6 weeks ago, given him back something critical by way of a diagnostic spell and a fall from 60 feet. He thought about 42. He thought about what 42 meant now, not a count of losses, not an accounting of damage, but a number that represented the thing that had been done and the thing that was being undone and the absolute certainty that undoing it was the right project, the right work, the most important thing. He thought, I know who my parents were. I know the shape of my father's hands on a toy broomstick. I know my mother called me Harry James when she was pretending to be stern. I know what it felt like to be safe. He thought, that's mine. That was always mine. And no one is taking it again. He kicked the broom into a dive, hard, committed, the pitch coming up fast, and he pulled up 6 feet above the grass, the air rushing against his face, his heart going, and climbed back up toward the gray November sky, and the castle watched him go, and everything that had been taken was coming back, and the boy who had spent 12 years not quite knowing who he was finally, definitively, did. Later, in the changing room with the smell of leather and old wood and the comfortable noise of the team shedding their post-practice selves, Oliver Wood came and sat next to Harry on the bench with his clipboard and looked at it for a moment and then put it down. The snitch time today, he said. 11 minutes. Yeah, Harry said. Personal best. Yeah. Oliver looked at him. What happened to you last month? I haven't. I don't have the full picture, I know that. Your business. But whatever happened? He paused, and Oliver Wood trying to find non-Quidditch words was a specific and endearing spectacle. You're flying differently, he said finally. Not just better. Differently. Like, he gestured vaguely at the air. Like you know where you're going. Harry pulled off his gloves. Yeah, he said. I think that's about right. Oliver nodded, satisfied with this as an explanation, because to Oliver Wood knowing where you're going was perhaps the most complete thing a person could be. He picked up his clipboard and went back to post-practice notes. Harry sat in the changing room and listened to Fred tell George a story about Peeves and a suit of armor and a regrettable incident involving a broomstick and a vanishing cabinet, and he listened to Leanna Marsh ask Angelina about the best lines for the Hufflepuff match in December, and he listened to the ordinary beautiful noise of a team that was his, in a castle that was his, in a world that was his, and he thought that this specific moment, this specific noise, this specific particular now, was something he was never going to let anyone take from him again. Not by obliviation. Not by well-meaning decisions made over his head. Not by fear, or strategy, or someone's idea of what was safer for the greater good. His. He picked up the notebook from his bag and wrote the last line in it, the last line on the last page that had any significance, the summary line, the one he'd been building toward without knowing it since he'd first opened his eyes in the hospital wing to find Madame Pomfrey sitting in the chair and a circled number and the beginning of a truth he'd been owed since before he could speak. He wrote, I remember everything that matters. And I'm just getting started. He capped the quill. He put the notebook in his bag. He went out into the November afternoon.